This story happened a long time ago. The story of a human king who opened a gate connecting the world he lived in with another world. After that incident, people fled in fear. They were filled with the magical creatures that crawled out of the open gate. The world behind the gate was apparently the home of demons who filled the entire region. Countless demons continued to roam, and the once calm and peaceful world was plunged into chaos. Countless people died, and the ground beneath their feet turned red. The human king began praying to God, begging for God's power to destroy the demonic creatures. Then a blinding light fell from the sky. The monsters under the light vanished into black smoke. Some people received special marks and gained magical skills that allowed them to fight the terrifying monsters. Others called them witches and began to respect them. Peace returned to their land. However, questions remain. Was it really God who granted the king's wish? A lively voice rang out from the palace. Many people had gathered there for the ball. The beautiful girl coyly remarked that she thought there would be witches present. If she had known only nobles would be present, she wouldn't have come. The maid addressed the girl as Miss Heron and said there were rumors of a possible appearance of a dark wizard. Sharon said she would only sing one song, then left. The maid reminded her that an alarm had been raised in Lupin Forest due to a monster, and that caravans passing through the forest had suffered severe damage. Sharon was annoyed that after such an incident, the nobles could still celebrate peacefully. She thought she wanted to meet the Dark Wizard. The audience eagerly awaited Sharon's performance as a singer. Many had heard that Sharon had a truly angelic voice. Sharon stared at the audience's faces in shock. She hadn't even started singing, but the horror was already evident on their faces. A monster appeared in the hall window behind Sharon, and the audience immediately fled in fear. Sharon stared at the approaching monster in amazement. She didn't understand what creature she was seeing. A stranger suddenly appeared in front of Sharon. The man shielded Sharon from the attack with his own body and then charged at the monsters. The stranger was a handsome young man dressed in black. The monsters continued to try to enter the hall through the window, but they were all destroyed by the young man in black. Monster blood spurted everywhere and hit Sharon in the face. The servant ran to Sharon and asked, "Is the girl okay?" Sharon said, "That man must be from Opian, the same dark wizard." She told the servant that the man was a dark wizard. The servant tried to calm Sharon and said that the girl should be taken to a safe place first. People were shocked after hearing about the dark wizard. Someone said that the man was a celebrity from a place called Opian. It was said that on that day he saved many lives. The dark wizard saw Sharon and approached. He asked, "Is Sharon hurt?" Sharon replied that she was fine. The dark wizard said he was glad to hear that. Then, although it wasn't the right time, he asked, "Is it okay to ask for a favor?" Sharon replied, "Of course he'll do anything." The dark wizard said, "Then maybe he can get Sharon's autograph." He handed Sharon a piece of paper and a pen, then asked for her signature and name. The dark wizard walked down the corridor. People around him whispered in surprise as they saw him, then tried to talk to him. At the same time, the dark wizard himself couldn't shake the thought of how much he hated crowded places. That's why he didn't want to appear here in this uniform. Suddenly, a woman's voice called out to the man, calling him Blow. The woman was a beautiful girl named Ren, who asked what he was doing at the main gate at this hour. She had come to submit a mission report to the master. The Dark Mage answered in the affirmative, and added that the job was anything but pleasant. Ren said he was glad Blow had finally made it. Blow looked at some documents in Ren's hands and asked, "What are all those?" Ren replied nothing special. He then hurriedly left, saying that the master was in the study. He also suggested they have lunch together later. As he left, Ren dropped some documents. Blow picked them up and called out to Ren. But the man's gaze suddenly stopped on the contents of the paper. The contents were a blatant advertisement for the services of a black magician. Ren looked horrified as Blow saw the writing, and the man asked, "Is this the master's doing?"
Ren said it was supposed to remain a secret. He tried to defend himself by saying he genuinely refused, but the master had already made up his mind. Ren wanted to say something more, but Blow had already left. The man in the study stood facing the window. He was enjoying a drink in the pleasant weather when the dark wizard suddenly burst into the study. The man was annoyed when someone opened the door as if trying to rip it off its hinges. Then a piece of paper was thrown at his face. Blow asked what this meant, referring to the document. The master was pleased to see Blow arrive and said he had been expecting him. The dark wizard was annoyed. He pointed to the paper and demanded an explanation. Master quickly tore it into small pieces. Then, with a straight face, Master said he didn't even know what Blow wanted to show him. Blow became angry and said that lately no place had given him peace. Everywhere he appeared, a crowd surrounded him. First, the master asked him to appear in this form and then do the same. The master mockingly remarked that the star named Blow was actually shy. Blow finally lost his temper and slammed his palm on the table. The master gasped in surprise. Then the master's face brightened and he happily announced that Blow had finally gotten Serena's autograph. Blow says this is the last time and there should be no more absurd tasks disguised as missions. Master says that's impossible. There's an important task here that only Blow can handle, finding Alan's missing puppy and delivering Rowan's love letter. Master clings to have successfully obtained the signature, while Sen is known for not communicating with strangers due to her difficult character.
Blow said he didn't notice anything unusual, although Seren seemed uneasy about the attack. This made Master worry. Master said that the Rafi area where Seren was operating was considered a safe zone. So, did they really encounter bandits? Blow replied that the attackers were monsters. The monsters weren't particularly strong, but their appearance in Rafi seemed odd since the area was protected by towers. The master replied that it was indeed strange and that the case definitely needed to be investigated. He also remarked that it was a good thing that Blow managed to get an autograph despite being in that condition. The master also asked how long Ruud planned to remain in this form. Ruud replied that thanks to someone's foolish mission, he had acquired an abundance of magical powers. He was once called Blow Awakened Release. Master noticed that Ruud had improved a lot since their last meeting. Ruud laughed in response, as if to say, "Is that so?" Ruud said that since he had brought the signature, Master should now give him a normal mission. Master said since that day the mages have been keeping a close eye on Ruud, and Sheikh of the association has been actively searching for that man. Master added that the situation would soon become much dangerous, and this worried him. Ruud asked, did that really come from the man who created all this? And then showed him a flyer advertising dark wizards. After that, Ruud said, enough joking, will Master give him a new mission or not? Master replied that there was a big deal. An auction where rare and unique items are sold is held once a year. This time, information surfaced that a magic stone with a name engraved on it would be up for auction. In other words, it was a high-class magic stone. The master said the problem was that other wizards also knew about the stone's existence, so this mission could be quite fun. The master stared at a document and thought about how he'd never managed to show it to Ruud. Ruud would probably throw a tantrum over it. The document was the acceptance letter for 15-year-old Ruda Christie to the Helios Magic School. This time, a large crowd had gathered for the auction.
The host announced that the moment they had all been waiting for had finally arrived. The auction began. Ren remarked that there were so many people here. Was the magic stone named Sajar's Heart really that powerful? Ruud replied that it was extremely difficult to find high-grade magic stones nowadays. Ren noticed the large number of magicians present and quietly asked if the Dark Mage was truly confident in handling the situation. Ruud said there shouldn't be a problem. Everyone has their own goals and he had his own. Ruud wondered what part of this all seemed funny to the master. He remembered asking the master about this mission. The master had replied that someone who had deeply wounded their client would appear at the auction. So he was looking for a vengeance. A wild magician had completely ruined their client's life and the client wanted just retribution. Master said he'd done some research and learned that the magician was a typical villain who exploited and deceived the weak. He handed Ruud a piece of paper. The paper stated that Dan Marshall, with the magical name Cloak, was a third-rank mage who had previously been imprisoned but received only a warning and was then released. Ruud hoped his master wasn't ordering him to kill the man. The master replied that then shouldn't be allowed to die, because the auction would feature a high-grade magic stone. A crowd would gather there. In such a crowd, Ruud had to find Dan first, then capture him. Ruud asked if he should torture Dan or simply break his legs. However, master said that after capturing Dan, Ruud would have to pull down the man's pants.
Ruud immediately irritated upon hearing such order. The master explained that the mage was once a member of the now destroyed criminal organization Coatl. However, some members managed to escape. Raiden, where the auction was taking place, held a strong grudge against Coatl. It was said that Coatl members had a tradition of carving special marks on their feet using poison lemons, which could not be removed. If the mark was shown in front of a large audience, this revenge would feel truly wonderful. Ruud asked, "What if it's just a rumor?" And when he opened it, there was no mark there. However, the master said that even that would be a wonderful revenge. Ruud said he didn't want to do it and tried to leave, but in the end he gave in and now watched the auction as it began. When Ren asked if he was sure about all this, Red replied that he would somehow manage. A little girl, amazed by the large crowd, leaned over the railing. The man accompanying her quickly pulled her back to her seat and told her that princesses weren't allowed to play around here. The girl said she had a strong feeling that something interesting was going to happen here. She then asked Tessie what she thought. She spoke to the young woman standing near the door, but Lady Tessiana was asleep. In the next box sat a young man named Lapis. The person she spoke to advised Lapis to focus and observe the situation carefully. There were so many magicians gathered here, so something interesting was bound to happen. Lapis agreed with her father's words. The wolf-eared man spoke to a young man named Sheik. He reminded him that their mission was to protect the magic stone. It should be protected, not destroyed. However, Sheik continued to pluck leaves from the branches and ignored the man.
The wolf-eared man repeated his instructions, but Sheik shushed him. Sheik continued tearing leaves from the twig. Finally, he cut the last one. After that, he stood up and said he would be back. Meanwhile, the auction continued. The master of ceremonies announced that it was time for today's main lot. Some of those present may already be familiar with this item. The host began. It is an extremely rare and valuable item. It is the greatest magic stone, imbued with the power of the mighty Charge. The host presented the supreme magic stone, the Heart of Shajarn, to the audience. Everyone was amazed. The manager, noting the stone's dazzling light and immense power, declared that they all had a chance to become its owner. Ren asked, "Has Ruud found the target?" Ruud replied that he couldn't see clearly yet. He explained that the auras of everyone present were mixed together, and that something might have changed, preventing the target from coming. Then Ren said, "All right, time to start preparing." Ruud pulled back the curtain on the booth. He said his name was Blow and activated his awakening. Ren remarked that the sight was truly mesmerizing. Magicians who could change their appearance could be counted on one hand. Ren added that a young boy like him could transform into such a handsome young man. Ren asked about his mana level. Ruud, or rather Blow, said his mana was more than sufficient. But, more importantly, it had already begun. They looked out of the box. The soldiers guarding the auction looked confused. An unknown man held a blade to Stuart's neck and shouted for everyone to stand down. He and his companions stared at the magic stone. They declared that the Heart of Shajarn was now theirs.
Ren remained calm and asked Blow who it was. The guards moved closer to the kidnappers, shouting for them to drop their weapons. One of the kidnappers told the guards to retreat. Suddenly, a powerful sonic boom struck them. The soldiers were unable to move and quickly lost their fighting ability. The magic attack originated from a strange object in the kidnapper's hand. Soon, the manager and the guards were lying helpless on the floor. The kidnapper mockingly stated that he was so bored he couldn't wait any longer. For that reason, he stated they would take this stone and then extend it to him. But someone grabbed his arm and stopped him. It was a man with wolf ears. The kidnapper smiled sinisterly and asked who he was. Then he received a powerful magic attack on his hand. He looked at his injured hand and realized the man was a renowned mage from the association. Upon hearing the word association, the crowd began whispering. Someone remembered that there was indeed a tailed and floppy-eared mage in the association. He was the association's hunting dog, the Lanos Hound. The man laughed as he overheard the conversation among the crowd. "You're the ones who are like dogs," he said. Then he asked the rascal, who dares call him Hound? One of the kidnappers muttered something about a damn mongrel from the association, then threw a magic item in his hand at the wolf-eared man. It hit the back of the wolf-eared man's head. The kidnappers looked on expectantly, waiting to see what would happen. But the wolf-eared man didn't seem to have sustained any significant injuries.
He glanced at the kidnappers, his voice low, and remarked that it hurt. Ren, sounding surprised, noted that he thought they only had weaklings, but it turned out they had a hidden trump card. And surprisingly, that trump card was actually a magician from the association. Blow nudged him. "Look more closely, Ren. The man was the very same magician he had been with before." Instantly, the two kidnappers were knocked unconscious. The wolf-eared man turned to the magicians, his voice cold. "If you act on the grain," he warned, "the outcome will be dire." He didn't stop there. "Anyone who touches the magic stone or even shows the slightest suspicious intent will be dealt with by me." After delivering the warning, he turned to leave, but then he stopped. The magic stone? It was gone. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, "The stone! It's over there!" They pointed toward a massive statue, and there, standing right on top of its head, was a red-haired young man, the stone clutched in his hand. It was him, Sheik Muan. Sheik spoke up, his eyes scanning the area. "I have a feeling that person is definitely here." The wolf-eared man frowned, unable to grasp what Sheik was trying to achieve. Sheik held the stone out, tauntingly. "If Chernis wants it, she can try and take it. Otherwise, I'll just eat it." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. "That's him, that's Sheik Muan from the association." Ren looked over at Blow. "When he mentioned Chernis, he was talking about you, wasn't he?" Blow remained silent. Ren sighed. "This is getting way more complicated than I thought. If we show ourselves now, we won't be able to escape easily." He paused, then whispered, "Maybe we should retreat?" But Blow didn't budge. "I won't abandon the mission," he said firmly, "not for a mere speck of dust, a speck of red dust."
Ren could only hope they would find a way out of this situation. Someone in the crowd said they came here for the high-level stone, but because of Shikmuar, their chances of getting it were gone. He said there were several magicians here. Perhaps they should attack together all at once? However, someone replied that they were all on a completely different level than Shikmuan, except for Chernis, who might be able to fight him. Meanwhile, Shikmuan remained standing on the statue's head, stone in hand. He remarked that it seemed he hadn't managed to scare the man. The wolf-eared man shouted at Shikmuan, "Stop messing around!" Suddenly, a powerful magic force hit the statue. The wolf-eared man and Shikmuan stared at each other in shock. Cracks spread throughout the statue. Then the statue began to fall, with Shikmuan still standing right on top of it. "What's happening?" the wolf-eared man shouted. But the statue had already collapsed. As the dust from the rubble began to clear, a figure emerged. It was Lady Tessiana. The wolf-eared man asked, "Was this Lady Tessiana's doing?" Lady Tessiana replied that she had come here to participate fairly in the auction and even brought a silver coin. Then she looked at Shikmuan and said that the man had disturbed her. However, Shikmuan denied it, saying it was the woman who was blocking them, calling Tessiana a mad woman. Ren noted that the blue-eyed woman had appeared out of nowhere, but thanks to her presence, the matter was further escalated, and they finally had a chance. Tessiana asked Blow, "Is that true?" Blow replied, "Yes."
Blow suddenly noticed a man standing in the crowd, right next to a woman. Earrings were visible on the man's ears, and even his lips. This was it. This was their target. Blow whispered to himself that he had finally found him. Suddenly, the sound of fighting erupted from the auction building. Lady Tessiana was fighting Shikmon. The blue-eyed girl looked deadly serious, attacking her opponent relentlessly. But Shikmon, he had no intention of giving up. He managed to withstand every single one of her attacks. Shikmon sneered. Why would someone who doesn't know their place dare to come forward?
Tiziana replied that the man wouldn't be able to control his emotions for long, and she continued to pressure her opponent. But then Shikmon counterattacked. He threw the girl far down, and Tiziana hit the floor with a loud bang. The crowd watched the fight in absolute amazement. From behind the cloud of dust, a silhouette began to rise. The girl stood up and announced her name, Tiziana. Shikmon watched her closely. Tiziana had used Awakening. Shikmon mocked her. Does that girl really think anything will change just because she's awakened? Tiziana told him he'd better get ready, and then she charged at Shikmon again. The princess shouted in excitement, Tiziana has awakened! This is going to be a spectacular sight! But the guard quickly cut in. Your Highness, please, remember Tiziana's behavior. She was supposed to be accompanying us. He added nervously that they had come here secretly, and he would be in serious trouble if anything happened to the princess. We should leave, the servant urged, before things get any worse. He then tried to lead the princess away.
This situation, the crowd was quickly approaching panic. Shouts rang out, evacuate, move, immediately. Things escalated even further when a magic stone fell right into the middle of the crowd. The hounds pushed through, shoving people aside. He thought angrily to himself, if Sigmund was going to fight, he should have just handed the stone to me first. At the same time, Blow made his way through the crowd, trying his best to remain inconspicuous. He followed his target, the man in purple. While the rest of the crowd was fixated on the magic stone, for Blow, this commotion was the perfect opportunity. He just had to find a way to reveal the emblem on the man's leg without arousing suspicion. Taking off someone else's pants? Yeah, definitely not a good idea. While Blow was thinking, a man next to him shouted out, Where is it? Who took the magic stone? Blow approached the man. I saw it, he said. It was taken by that man in purple. He pointed to the man being chased. It looks like he hid the stone in his pants. The man immediately charged. He grabbed the man in purple, demanding the magic stone back. Blow thought his plan had worked, but then the man was wounded in the arm and thrown aside. The man in purple drew his sword. How did you know? He demanded. I had almost succeeded in taking it. Blow was certain now. This man was clearly the one who took the magic stone. Since this stone is already in my possession, the man stated, I am definitely not handing it over. He looked around, his voice turning cold. My name is Clock. Suddenly, he used his awakening. The magic stone is mine, Clock added, and I will kill anyone who dares to take it.
The crowd backed away in fear, but then a man appeared out of nowhere and blocked Clock's path. It was Blow. Blow lunged at the purple-clad man. With a few quick strikes, he managed to disarm him. Grand! A spear appeared in Blow's hand, and he aimed it directly at Clock's face. Shikmun watched the scene intently, and so did Lady Tiziana. They both ran toward the battle. Clock lay on the floor. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, Dark Magic! The secret was out. Clock was a dark magician. Clock screamed, The magic stone is mine. I'll never give it to anyone. Blow looked at him coldly. Why do you think the stone belongs to you? He paused. I have no interest in the magic stone. I need something else. He glared at Clock. Suddenly, an attack swung towards Blow. He deflected the sword just in time, watching as a new enemy approached. But then, a hand grabbed Blow's clothes. It was Shikmun, the man they called Blackie. The shockwave from their class spread through the hall, and the crowd began to scatter in fear. Lady Tiziana was still recovering. That attack, it was quite painful, she whispered. She had lost her sword, but then she calmed herself. I won't lose, not next time. Clock tried his best to escape, but the crowd chased after him, shouting, He has the magic stone, catch him! Clock was furious. How dare these damn insects bother me? Weaklings should stay away. However, one of the spectators caught up to him. He leaned in and asked, Do you really think that everyone here is weak?
Spectator hit Clock hard. They engaged in a fight, and slowly a crowd began to gather around them. Lapis watched the duel between the Dark Mage and Shikmun. She realized that if things continued like this, the building would collapse. Lapis wanted to turn to her father, but he wasn't there. She asked Runa where her father was, and Runa replied that His Majesty had already left.
Lapis thought leaving now was the safest option, but she was just too eager to see the battle between such powerful magicians. Meanwhile, Ren was deeply concerned. How had things ended this way? The presence of Shikmun and the association was a total miscalculation. Furthermore, Ren hadn't brought a magic crystal to replenish his strength. He reasoned that the longer he delayed, the greater the loss for Blow. So, what should he do? Shikmun and Blow stood face to face. Blow stated clearly that he had no intention of fighting Shikmun. Shikmun replied, "Oh, did Blow really say that he didn't need the magic stone? And wasn't Shikmun's goal to protect the stone until the end of the auction? At least, that's what Shikmun's partner said." Blow stated that it would be better if they each minded their own business. He even added that Shikmun's magic rune looked stupid and suggested that the man remove it. Shikmun stated that he didn't care whether Blow needed the magic stone or not. He also didn't care whether Blow knew how long he had been searching for him since that day. Opian had hidden Blow as if he were some kind of treasure.
However, Sigmund accepts any task, any mission, if there's even a slight chance to meet Blow. Blow thinks he's been busy lately with other things, like getting autographs or pulling down his pants. Sigmund states that Blow is right in front of him and lunges. They collide once again. Sigmund said he wanted Blow to show him that just one more time. It was a moment that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Shards of glass fell from the ceiling. Someone shouted, "The building! It's starting to collapse!" The Hound Laos walked towards their fight. Was Sigmund really going to raise everything here to the ground? The man was simply too excited by everything that was happening. Laos thinks the auction has been cancelled, but if he manages to retrieve the magic stone, that could be an excuse. Meanwhile, Clock is surrounded. The crowd demands that he return the magic stone. Clock tries to break through, fighting back with magical attacks. The man Blow had previously spoken to shouted, "Clock has the magic stone! It's in his pants!" Clock tried to explain that it was all nonsense, but the crowd moved towards him menacingly. "It's not true!" he shouted. "Don't come any closer!" Blow said that this place was getting dangerous. They should leave immediately. The girls followed his advice. Blow thought some kind of nonsense was going on here. Why would he waste his magic power on a meaningless fight? He remembered that since that day, his master had only given him strange missions. Could it be that the man had already left the auction building? Even though this mission was practically a failure, Blow still had to confirm whether the sign was real.
Sigmund said that since the Dark Mage wasn't planning on fighting, he should leave the man to him. There were too many distractions here. As he made his way through this trash, someone would surely change their mind. Suddenly, a menacing voice rang out from above. Under the influence of the magic rune, the roof of the building began to collapse. Clock saw that the ceiling couldn't hold on any longer. He shouted to the people chasing him that they should look up. Clock thought that if he kept running, he still had a chance. But then, Blow knocked the man out with a magic blow and told the rest of the crowd that it was time for them to leave. Life was far more valuable than magic crystals, so it's best for everyone to leave this place. Blow said the building would collapse at any moment. Lakos shouted at Chickman to stop immediately. There were still people here. Was he really going to kill everyone in this place? Ren thought irritably things were really messed up now. He decided to find Blow immediately and used the teleportation scroll to get out of this place. Ren felt a little uneasy about what was happening. Dark Mage stood in front of the fallen clock. The man said that, as it turned out, Dark Mage was the one who drove people away from here, just so he could keep the magic stone for himself. Blow responded by saying that everyone always judges others based on their own self-image. Blow asked Clock of Kata if he is the one. Clock says that's nonsense, and that he has no connection to Katal. Blow says that there should be a mark on Clock's leg, and that the man is still trying to make a living in Raiden by any means necessary. Blow adds that, judging by Clock's reaction, his suspicions are correct, but he still needs to check things out for himself.
Clock shouted for Blow to stop. He said he would give him the magic stone, and then he handed it over. But suddenly, a powerful magic blow struck Clock. A voice rang out. "I already told you, I'm not interested in that stone.
So, what's the point of dealing with trash like this? Where's the fun in any of it? There, Shikmuan stood before Blow, casually holding the magic stone in his hand. Blow suggested they try talking first, but Shikmuan, he wasn't listening. He charged straight at him. He grabbed Blow's leg and threw him far to the side. "Come on," Shikmuan invited. "Play with me." Blow landed nearby, panting. He thought to himself, this guy is way too serious. It seemed a fight was inevitable. The two opponents began to prepare their attack, but then suddenly Blow felt the magic he'd gathered just disappear. Shikmuan realized something was wrong too. Laos ran over, looking around in complete surprise. A strange magic circle was appearing on the floor of the hall. The audience began to panic. No one understood why a magic circle would appear there. Several strange crystals emerged from the circle, and then monsters began crawling out of them. The crowd scattered in pure fear. Runa followed close behind her young master. "Where did these monsters come from?" Lapis asked. Runa replied, "They're crawling out of the magic circle." As the monsters began attacking the crowd, Lapis turned to Runa. "Give me my sword." She knew her skills might not be enough, but it was better to fight than to just stand there like a fool. Lapis stepped in front of the people being attacked. "Don't worry," she shouted. But then, in an instant, Lapis was thrown far to the side by the monster's powerful blow. Runa rushed to help and managed to catch the young master just in time. Runa landing softly, with Lapis on the floor. He wondered what kind of monster had appeared, an ugly jellyfish, or maybe a giant octopus. Runa summoned a magic bow and aimed straight at the monster. Lakos shouted, "What was that? Is this really a summoning circle?" Lakos looked at him in surprise and said that it seems so. Blow asked, "Are there any magicians who can summon monsters?" Lakos replied that he had never heard of such a thing. Dark Mage added that summoning so many monsters, especially in a place like this, seemed very strange. Ren ran over to them, and Blow asked why he hadn't left yet. Ren became angry, declaring that he wouldn't go alone like a coward. Laos saw Ren and wondered, who was this girl? She seemed to be Opian's partner, even though Ren didn't look like a magician. Laos summoned Shikmuan, who immediately appeared, along with rocks falling from the ceiling. Laos asked what happened to the magic stone. Shikmuan's voice was flat. "It's gone. It disappeared." Ren told Blow that they had to get out of this crazy place and that he'd used the teleportation scroll to do it. Blow was about to argue, but Shikmuan declared that he wouldn't let Blow go. "No one gave you that right!" Shikmuan shouted and attacked Blow. Ren, annoyed at what was happening in this situation, demanded that Laos stop his comrade. Then, Blow suddenly remarks that the magic hadn't disappeared. It seems the incident was only temporary.
He asked Shikmuan if he felt anything strange. Shikmuan replied that he too had noticed the loss of magic, and he didn't think it was Blow's doing. Something was wrong. Moreover, monsters had appeared. Blow said that now wasn't the right time for them to fight. However, Shikmuan replied that he didn't care and charged at Blow again. He aimed a powerful magic attack straight at him. Ren was terrified, but then Lakos stood in front of the Dark Mage and took the blow himself. He told Shikmuan to calm down. Overly stubborn men are truly annoying. Ren stated that because of all this commotion, the Tower of Mages would be flocking here like flies. They had agreed to try to avoid them. Blow noted that Lakos was taking the attack very easily, so they should just leave. But Shikmuan, he wasn't going to let Blow get away with it. He told Lakos that he wouldn't spare anyone who got in his way. Blow wondered, was this man serious? Ren reminded them that if M from the tower arrived, the cost would be enormous, so they had to leave immediately. "Ren, there's danger behind you," Blow shouted. Ren turned around and saw Lapis, sword in hand. She attacked a monster that had silently approached from behind. Lapis asked, "Is Ren okay?" Ren looked at her in surprise. He thought he should be the one asking if she was okay. Runa asked if she should help the young master. Meanwhile, Lapis was sent flying again from the monster's blow. Blow killed the creature with one strike and asked about Ren's condition. He explained that it was just a low-level monster, one with no core or intelligence. Runa approached Lapis and asked if she was okay. Lapis looked toward Ren and Blow and said, "That man, he's a Dark Mage, and the one over there is Shikmuan. They were the strongest magicians. Blow saw a clock lying among the rocks. He thought to himself that he hadn't finished confirming. Ren shouted at Blow, "Forget about the damn mission."
He felt like today was going to be a bad day, especially after such a bad night's sleep. Luckily, he brought the scroll call. Blow said it would be better if Ren went first, but Ren asked irritably if Blow really wanted to take off his pants. Lapis and Runa were stunned. I mean, can you blame them, hearing a conversation like that about pants? Blow pointed out that there were still monsters and people around, but Ren simply replied that the tower would handle all of this. It was, after all, entirely their responsibility. Ren then called out to Lapis. He said that while it would be an exaggeration to say she was a great help, wouldn't she and Runa want to go with them? Lapis paused, thinking it over. Ren muttered that he didn't even want to, but Lapis readily agreed, saying they would be very grateful for the help. Laos, on the other hand, felt like his head was going to explode. He was already getting a migraine just thinking about the report he'd have to write about this incident. He blamed Shikmuan for dragging him into this entire mess. Ren said, "The goal is to be where I want it. The condition is contact." Blow clarified, they must hold on to each other. Lapis watched Shikmuan approach anxiously. Shikmuan growled, "Why did Blow run away? And where did that previously confident bastard go?" Lapis looked at Shikmuan worriedly and whispered to Blow that Maj was looking at him like he wanted to kill them all. Blow replied that there was no need to worry. He must be having a staring contest with himself, he said, before urging Ren to hurry. But Ren snapped back, asking him not to interrupt. He needed to concentrate. Shikmuan shouted, "Does Blow really think I'll let him get away that easily? Damn Chish!" Suddenly, the magic circle on the ceiling began to glow, fiercely.
Los shouted. "Whatever it is, Lapis said it's the same as before." Blow urged Ren again. Ren concentrated and finally activated the teleport. A powerful explosion shook the auction building. A magic circle landed in someone's palm and was destroyed by that very hand. A man with narrowed pupils and a small monster perched on his shoulder remarked that the scene was quite interesting. He asked his interlocutor if she agreed with him. The man's companion, a girl with small horns whom he called Mr. Ruby Montier, sat nearby holding a magic stone. Ruby said, "There's nothing interesting here. Why make such a big show for such a trivial matter?" Then he crushed the magic stone in his hand. Ruby Montier added contemptuously that humans are worthless creatures. The master's office in Opian. The master noted that the auction building was destroyed, the magic stone was missing, and an unknown monster had appeared. He added that the scene was really funny, and laughed. Ren grumbled that the master had sent them there just to take off MJ's pants, and yet they ended up getting involved in this kind of trouble. It must have all been truly hilarious indeed. The master said he was still relieved that they both returned safely. If only he had known Shikmuan would be there, he would never have sent them. He wondered, why was that man so obsessed with Blow? It seemed like it wasn't just a desire to fight. That family, they had always been a bit crazy. Ren was shocked to hear that that family was involved. The master said that the man's interest would fade over time, so for now they should avoid him, even if it felt unfair. He added that there was something odd about the case, and that he had become suspicious the moment he heard about a high-grade magic stone being at the auction.
The mass summoning of monsters and loss of magical power that also couldn't be ignored. Ren said this incident would cause a major uproar, both in the association and the tower. Even the master was asking where Red had gone right after throwing that unfinished report onto the desk. Red, meanwhile, was sitting in a tavern reading. As expected, he muttered to himself, "There are no records of monster summoning." Just then, a small boy approached with a cup. "The drink is ready," he announced. His name was Ben, and he was easily recognized by his bright green hair. "Ruud, we haven't seen each other in a long time," Ben said. "Maybe it's because you're studying too much?" Ben looked down at the book and remarked, "Everything in here seems so complicated. I had no idea Big Brother Rat was so smart." "I've only just realized it myself," Rat replied. "But tell me, Ben, does it seem like there are a lot of visitors today?" "Not that many," Ben replied. "Everyone is just busy, discussing the Dark Mage's trail." Rat looked confused. Well, Ben began to explain. Raffi had an expensive magic stone, right? Then an evil magician tried to steal it, but the dark magician appeared and saved everyone. Rod smiled awkwardly, the memory of the place being destroyed by the explosion flashing through his mind. I wish my older sister could become a powerful mage, Ben added wistfully, just like the dark magic. Ruud was shocked to hear about Ben's sister. She just entered Helios school, Ben explained. But it isn't just any school. Helios is a prestigious institution. They only accept the most exceptional individuals. Ben's voice trailed off. I'm just very sad not to be with her.
But at least he could still write letters. His mother told Ben not to write too often so as not to bother his older brother. But Ben had already written 10 letters. Then Ben said he had to serve another customer, and just like that, he ran off. Ruud listened to the conversations of the people around him. They were talking about how Sheikmuan had won. The Black Mage saved everyone there. Clock swallowed the magic stone. There were even rumors that the Black Mage was a woman. Ruud wondered just how many rumors were circulating and how one man was bearing all the blame. Yet somehow, no one mentioned the monster. Perhaps the tower had a hand in this, as the city was protected by their barrier. Perhaps something had happened to that barrier? Ruud thought it was a good thing he had drawn the magic circle he had seen in such detail. Perhaps it would be helpful in the future. After finishing his drink, he decided it was time, finally time, to meet the master. A strange sound was heard, coming from the roof of a building in Opion. A woman's voice asked, "What is going on?" Lispin replied that there was a bit of a commotion up ahead, but nothing to worry about. He asked, "Is everything all right with Miss Dinner?" Miss Dinner replied that everything was fine, and there was no need to worry too much. She added that if she could be of any use to the child, she would do anything to ensure that it was so. Ruth walked down the street, staring at the piece of paper she held. She thought that simply looking at the magic circle wouldn't answer her question. Suddenly, a gust of wind snatched the paper from Ruth's hand and dragged it along the sidewalk. Ruth immediately chased after it.
He wondered how far the paper would fly. Suddenly, a young man shouted for them to return his belongings immediately. The leader of the suspicious group claimed he was simply picking up a discarded bag. The young man tried to explain that he was just putting it away, but the leader grabbed him right by the collar. The leader said he might consider it if the young man begged. But the young man, he just screamed. "Think carefully," the leader warned. "Would you die first, or would the guards come running?" Then a piece of paper hit the leader right in the face. He threw it away in a fit of anger. "The bag is mine now," the leader added. "Now, get out of here." Taking the paper, Ruth said sadly, "It's dirty." The bag that had been the subject of the argument was now hanging from Ruth's arm. The leader shouted, enraged, "What kind of child is this?" Meanwhile, Red returned the bag to its rightful owner. The bandits shouted for Red to return it, but Red simply said he had picked it up and then politely asked them to leave. The young man didn't wait. He immediately ran away, clutching his bag. The leader's voice turned menacing. Since this little boy ruined everything, he needs to be taught a lesson, a big one. He ordered his men to block the exit. Rod assessed the situation. He was facing a weak, low-class power mage. "You don't seem to understand how this world works," the leader sneered. "Therefore, you need to be taught a lesson." Red decided right then that causing trouble wasn't worth it. He'd rather just flee.
She darted forward. Then, under the shocked gazes of the bandits, she jumped from the roof. At the same time, a carriage passed below. Mrs. Dinner heard a noise from above. It turned out Ruth had landed right on the roof of her carriage. Ruth thought with relief. The carriage is quite sturdy. He jumped down to the ground and ran. The men escorting the carriage stared at him in surprise. One of the riders shouted, asking what it was, and called out to Sir Spen. Ruth heard someone bark at her to stay still. Then she felt the cold blade of a sword against her neck. She thought to herself, "This man is quite fast." Sir Lispen asked, "Does Ruth know whose carriage he just stepped on?" Ruth replied that he did not. He bowed politely and apologized. He couldn't believe there was a noble riding in that carriage. Even if the circumstances were unavoidable, he still shouldn't have done what he did. He sincerely apologized for the inconvenience. From now on, he would be careful. So Could they forgive him just this once? Slightly surprised, Sir Spen replied, "Very well." Ruth thanked him again and hurried off. One of the guards laughed, remarking how sincere the boy's apology was, then asked Lisbon, "Why did you raise your sword to a child?" Lisbon countered, asking if he really thought the child was just an ordinary kid. Ruth had landed perfectly, despite falling from such a height. That couldn't be considered the ability of an ordinary child. His interlocutor simply explained that Lisbon himself had never been involved in a mid-class monster hunt.
The boy! He seemed to have such a promising future. Perhaps they should take a chance, take him on as their apprentice. Lady Dinner had been paying close attention to their conversation. She noticed it too, that the boy seemed both strong and intelligent. Lisbon's companion suggested that since the lady thought so too, well, perhaps they should bring the boy here and recruit him into their squad. But under Lisbon's stern gaze, he finally fell silent. Sir Lisbon hoped Miss Diner hadn't been hurt by the impact. Miss Diner said she was fine, but since they were near their destination and the weather was so nice, she wanted to walk a bit. Sir Lisbon replied that everything was as the lady wished. Then they continued on foot. Ruth, observing them, thought that the lady was indeed a noblewoman and that the man with her was quite capable. However, it was a good thing he let her go. Ruth thought that luck had been against her lately and that she would never see them again. Mrs. Dinner sat on the sofa with a sweet smile. Sir Spen and his companion stood behind her. They were in the master's office. The master himself and Ruud sat opposite them. Ruud suggested that perhaps he should leave, but the master stopped him, insisting he should stay and listen. Mrs. Dinner asked, "Is this the same child?" The master replied that, though small and inconspicuous, Ruud was one of Opion's greatest talents. Miss Dinner said that since he was from Opion, he must be a legitimate magician. The master explained that although Ruud had only recently become a 7th rank mage, he was the best among his peers. There must be a lot of hidden talent in Opion. Even on the streets, rumors circulated about dark mages. They said they possessed extraordinary talent. Since he was already here, he wanted to meet the figure at the center of the rumors. The master said, with a sweet smile, that he was sorry, but the Dark Major was currently on a mission. Mrs. Dinner said that if that was the case, there was nothing that could be done. She realized the conversation had strayed slightly from the main task and told Rod that they would meet again. Master and Rod stared at the woman in confusion. Mrs. Dinner explained that Rod had never seen her before, but that she was the owner of the train that Rod had hit. In response to Master's question, Rod replied that it was just a coincidence. Mrs. Dinner suggested that perhaps it was fate. She told Master Opian that this child could be trusted completely. The Master replied that he was grateful to Duchess Artian for the trust placed in him. It turned out that Madame Dinner was a duchess. Rod thought that he had indeed suspected her to be a noble, but he had never imagined her status as a duchess. Duchess Artian said it was time to discuss the main business. Since she had already informed Master Opian about this matter, Rod probably already knew about it. The reason she had come here in person was because of her second son, who was currently at Helios. "So, it turns out you wanted to tell us about the second young master, Duchess?" The Duchess confirmed that her second son was having trouble at school. She instructed her second bodyguard, Friend. Friend sat down a stack of documents and explained that they contain information about Helios, a student list, and a report on the current situation. Rod thought to himself, he had already heard enough about Helios for one day. The Duchess said that her son had only entered Helios a month ago and didn't know what had happened. But now, the boy was being called a monster there. The master was shocked. Who would dare treat the second young master like that? The Duchess replied that her son wasn't the only noble there, and that after entering the school, outside interference in school affairs was strictly prohibited. She added that the child was extremely sensitive. Since childhood, all his affection and attention had been stolen by his older brother. The child grew up lonely and withdrawn. Even she herself was unable to give him the attention he deserved. Her son became so fragile that he was unable to express the pain he had been hiding.
Daisy said he didn't want the child to be hurt again, and more importantly, he couldn't allow their family members to be treated like that in that place. Daisy said their task was simple: help the child begin a peaceful school life in a place where he was called a monster. Protect him. After Daisy left them, Rod said he was waiting for an explanation. He explained that he was referring to this ridiculous and unreasonable situation. With an innocent smile, the master said it was exactly as Rod had heard. Daisy had made a request and Rod would be responsible for completing the mission. Rod said that master must be joking. Besides, how could master imagine himself in such a situation? Master replied that he couldn't possibly say that Rod was their dark magician. He added that Rod shouldn't worry. Helios may be an elite school, but all the students there are still unawakened. Rod asked, haven't you received the report about Ren's failed mission and that they need to investigate what happened there? The master said that he would handle that personally, while Rod would handle this mission. Then the master handed him a document. It was Ruda Christie's acceptance letter to the Helios Magic School.
Rod said, This must be a joke. Master tried to explain everything, but Rod, he just immediately returned the letter. Rod told him flatly, the relationship was over. Thank you very much for everything. It was a pleasure working with you, but from now on, I'm leaving Opian. Master shouted back, I've done so much for you, Rod. He had fed him, gave him water, he even kept him awake at night. How could you do such a thing to me? Rod snapped, and how could you do all that without saying a single word to me? I would never, ever agree to go to school. The master insisted that this wasn't a school at all. It was a mission. But Rod replied that he didn't want to accept any mission. The master pleaded, Don't you understand? All I want is to educate you, even if it's done this way. My feelings are deeper than the ocean. Rod felt even more lost, trying to understand what was happening. Right then, Ren called out to them, asking what they were doing there. Ren, couldn't you have knocked before entering? Master snorted. We were talking about something important. Ren just sighed. I already knocked. Then he told them both to sit down and stop embarrassing themselves in front of the entire district. Rod looked at him. Do you really know about all this? Ren said, Look, you don't need to take this matter too seriously. It's better to think of it as a fun, relaxing trip. The students there, they'll just seem like little kids to you, Rod. It's a good opportunity to take a break, experience school life, and maybe make friends with people your own age. There's nothing scary about it. Rod muttered, I don't need friends.
The master said that if Ruud didn't want to handle this mission, that was fine. Dutch themselves had already traveled to Opian and entrusted the mission to them. They simply had to tell the dukes that they couldn't accept it. Of course, the master's head might not disappear after that, but if it put Ruud at ease, then all was well. Ren intervened, saying that enough of this nonsense was enough. The master was clearly at fault for starting this without discussing it with Ruud first. Since he was officially enrolled, Ruud would be going to school, but because this mission might take a long time, the decision was still his. Ren asked, So what do you want? Ruud said, That means I just have to help the Duke's second son? Ren and the master stared at him in disbelief. The master replied that it was true and that the mission wouldn't be too difficult at all. Ren stated that Ruud was indeed extraordinary. He'd expected nothing less from the star of the show. Ruud asked, Is the school uniform ready? He wondered if he should start packing, though part of him thought he should probably just decline. The master explained that he told the Duke that Ruud is a level 7 mage, but the school, they don't know that he's an official awakened mage. This means Ruud can't be their blow. The master assured him that there wouldn't be anything dangerous there, but he just needs to be careful of the teachers. After all, they were official magicians. The master also said that this mission would be a vacation for Dark Mage Ruud. However, at the same time, this would be Ruud Christie's first mission. Ruud thought to himself that the master was indeed good at playing with words. Meanwhile, Ren was already thinking about what clothes to give him, and Ruud, he was just reading the information, thinking about how he was going to help the child.
A photo of a young man with a frightening gaze caught Ruud's attention. Ruud thought the young man indeed had quite a frightening appearance. He placed the photo on the table and asked, "Is this person the mastermind behind the bullying of the Duke's second son?" Ren and Master hesitated before answering. Then Master spoke up. This man was actually Libos Dian Arten, the person who was mocked and called a monster, the second young master of Artian. At the Opian post office, Ben asked the clerk why his letter couldn't be delivered. The clerk replied that Helios was very strict about accepting foreign goods, so they couldn't accept letters without a certificate. The clerk also mentioned that if Ben's older sister was studying there, she should have a certificate, and Ben should ask his parents for one. Ben sighed, saying his mother wouldn't let him send the letters. "Can't you just send them?" he asked. But the clerk apologized. He couldn't help without the certificate. Suddenly, Ruud appeared. She said she had the certificate and asked that the letters be sent to Helios along with her belongings. Ben stared at Ruud in surprise, but Ruud assured him he could deliver the letters. Helios Magic School. The school day began. The students were all talking about the same person coming today, the only student to pass the entrance exam with honors. The professors apparently had made a big fuss about it. A silver-haired girl thought irritably that this place was just too noisy. Still, the next lesson looked like it would be interesting. Nearby, a blue-haired student was sleeping on a desk. Someone whispered, "Faris has fallen asleep, again." Meanwhile, another girl showed off the jewelry she had just bought to her friends after being excused. A long-haired young man entered the classroom. Conversations among the students immediately ceased. The long-haired student walked across the room and sat down in his seat. Everyone watched him, in silence. Someone whispered softly, "The monster." The silver-haired girl was satisfied that the atmosphere had finally quieted down. The long-haired student sat silently at his desk. "It's Dian Arten," Ruud asked in surprise. "Top marks on the entrance exam, and a chronic illness?" Master and Ren nodded in agreement. Ruud groaned. They were serious? How could he possibly get a perfect score on an exam he'd never even seen before? And what kind of illness was that anyway? Master boasted that Ruud was talented, and then said that things somehow worked out this way in the end. He said that about a month had passed since the new student began studying, and Ruda's invitation had also come a month ago. Red should have gone there since then, but the timing wasn't right. He hadn't figured it out yet. Therefore, a valid reason was needed to delay the meeting, and it had to be something the strict Helios could accept. A fragile, yet brilliant and handsome boy. Doesn't that sound like fun? Ruud realized he was being pranked, but there was nowhere to run. Student Christie. The sound of someone calling him snapped Red out of his reverie. The teacher asked what he was thinking about, and told him to follow along as class was about to start. Ruud thought if the registration certificate had arrived a month ago, it meant the application had been submitted early. This meant the master had intended to send him to the school even before the mission appeared. So what was he supposed to do here now? Ruud thought, as expected of a magic school, manhwa flows everywhere.
However, since the situation was already like this, they just needed to complete the mission quickly and return. The teacher explained that people of all ages and statuses came here, so such things weren't important. Ruth asked, "What's important in this place?" The teacher then replied, seriously, that the most important thing here was talent. First-year students often feel excited upon entering the school, imagining they'll become extraordinary magicians. It's as if they already are. However, this is nothing more than a misconception. Simply entering Helios doesn't mean they'll become official magicians. In fact, many students fail to overcome their own limitations and fall into despair. The teacher asked, "What about her? She was the first person to get a perfect score on the entrance exam." Ruth replied that if effort alone wasn't enough, then she should just drop out of school. The teacher laughed, saying that Ruth had a sense of humor. Ruth thought that passing the exam with the highest score was much harder than she had ever imagined. The teacher said that Helios always welcomes talented students and congratulates them from the bottom of his heart. Helios is a school specializing in magic, a place filled with those gifted with the ability to sense and use mana, with the goal of nurturing them into true magicians who bear the emblem.
Based on ability, students are divided into the advanced class Hairs. the intermediate class treasure, and the lowest class Aiden. First-year students start with Aiden and can advance to the next grade through an annual exam. The teacher introduced him as Ruda Kisti, explaining that he joined the class late due to health issues. She asked the students not to make him an outcast just because he was a little late, and to try to get along well. Then, the teacher told him to greet the others. Ruud told everyone he looked forward to working with them. The students began whispering, discussing him. Meanwhile, Ruud looked around the classroom to find the person who brought him here. And finally, he did. There he was, Artian's second son, the monster who was being teased, Lydian. Ruud wondered, why was he sitting there alone? The teacher told Ruud to sit in an empty chair. As he sat, Ruud noticed Lydian again. He didn't look weak or vulnerable, but at the same time, he was being bullied and called a monster. Ruud decided that he had to understand the situation first. There's no need to rush. It's better to observe first. The student sitting in the front turned and greeted him. He called Ruud the local genius. Then he asked, "Is it true that you passed the exam with a perfect score? And how old are you, Ruud?" Ruud replied that he was 15 years old. The student said he knew Ruud was younger than him, and then mentioned that he was 17.
Then, the man introduced himself. He said his name was Dio Faris, and that there was no need for any formal language. Ruud could just call him Dio. After all, age was just a number. The teacher noted that he understood why Dio, who was admittedly in last place in the rankings, wanted to be friends with Ruud Christie. But the teacher asked that their conversation be postponed until break time. Ruud decided that the best thing to do for now was to just sit back and observe quietly. After class, the students gathered around. They began asking questions, eager to get to know the newcomer. Ruud reasoned that as long as he didn't shine too brightly, there shouldn't be any problems. But it turned out they were quite curious. They kept pestering her with questions even as they walked by. Ruud thought maybe it was just because it was the first day of school that everyone was being so friendly. Suddenly, Dio told everyone to step aside. He had an important mission, to show the new student around the school. Ruud glanced at where Leorsus had been sitting, only to see that he had disappeared. Where could he have gone? It would be interesting to find out. At that moment, Dio called out to his new friend, announcing that it was time to begin their journey. It was time to see the school. And as Dio remarked, the school was absolutely huge.
So, at first, Ruud might get lost, but after a few days, he'll get the hang of things. Dio asks if he can just call him R, and Ruud agrees. Dio says he was very nervous when he first arrived. It's hard to get in here, you know, unless you're a noble. He thought the fun was just around the corner, but in reality, nothing has changed. He came in last on the exam. Dio said that Ruud was amazing. If Ruud was the first person to pass the exam with an A, then Dio, he was the complete opposite. Ruud said that Dio was also amazing. Out of all the students, he managed to come in last, and that was impressive. Not everyone could do that. Dio froze in shock. He asked Ruud not to say such things with such a serious face. This was where they would be spending most of their time. This was the central library of Helios. It was enormous, and there were countless books. They even maintained a sound silencing spell over the students of Manus. You can concentrate fully on the books. Ruud thought the cost of all this must be enormous. The library had 4 floors, but now they only had access to the first floor. It was the lower class area. Suddenly, someone called Dio, the man with the blue hair and gloomy face. A student asked, "Is he in Professor Halil's class?"
Dio replied that he was right. The student, he had the Kore symbol on his sleeve. Ruud thought he might be from the advanced class. The student asked, "How's the monster from their class?" Dio replied that he was fine. "Too bad," the student said. Then he told them they could go back to their business and just left. Dio said his heart nearly leaped out of his chest. Ruud asked why he was so nervous, just because the guy was from the advanced class? Dio sighed. It seems Ruud had never experienced a true hierarchical society. He told Ruud he would impart secret knowledge to help him survive the difficult life on Helios. Rule number 1, he began, is to never mess with the advanced class of Heras. They are selected individuals, people with exceptional talent and skills recognized by the school. There are fewer than 20 of them, but their skills, they're comparable to 100 Edens. Therefore, their privileges are commensurate with their abilities. One mistake and Ruud's peaceful life would end that very day. They were the elite among the disciples. To the common people, they were like stars in the sky. Ruud asked, "Then, what's the second rule?" Dio leaned in and whispered in her ear, "The second rule is to be wary of a disciple named Shebil von Hadalo."
Explained that the person was that blonde man they had just seen. You should be wary of him, he warned. It's best to avoid him if you see him. They're talented, of course, but their characters, they're problematic. Ruud mockingly asked if their characters were necessarily bad, but Dio hissed at her, telling her to slow down and be serious. Ruud needed to hear that for her own good. Chef von Hadelio was the heir to the respected Mary's Hadelio, and because of his family, even the professors didn't want to mess with him. If you cross paths with him, you'll be hunted to the death. Your life will become a living hell. Rod said he'd be careful, then asked, "So, why is that guy called a brat?" Dio's reply was grim. "He is a living example of what happens if you mess with a Hadelio." Ruud asked for more details, but Dio avoided the topic, insisting there were still many places left to visit. They stopped by the central fountain, went to the magic item shop, and visited several other interesting spots. By the time their journey ended, Rod decided it had felt more like an expedition than a tour. Who would have thought it would take a whole day? Rod couldn't help but think that this bastard knew quite a lot, despite only being here for a month. Finally, a school employee arrived. "Your luggage arrived just in time," he said, informing Rod that he could stay in a temporary room until they found him a roommate.
Ruud asked if the issue had been resolved. The employee explained that according to the rules, 2 students must share a room, but currently there were no spare rooms for his class. Ruud asked, "Are there any spare rooms left at the school?" The employee looked surprised. She explained that she had heard Liorsis the NR lived alone in a single room. Ruud stood in front of the door. She held the key in her hand, recalling the clerk's reaction to her request. The clerk had said he'd only placed her in this room because she had asked him to. "And if you change your mind," he told her, "you can always come back to me." Ruud sighed. It was going to be quite difficult to persuade that clerk. She snorted. It was time to meet the main target of the mission. She knocked on the door. No one answered. Ruud concluded that no one was inside, so she opened the door and entered. The room turned out to be large enough for 2 people. Liorsis was there, lying on the bed, his body covered with a blanket. Ruud was surprised that Liorsis was sleeping at a time like this. She pulled back the covers and saw that he was indeed sleeping peacefully. Ruud thought that, given the circumstances, Liorsis shouldn't be sleeping quite so peacefully. She decided it was time to unpack and get him out of bed. He didn't see Liorsis watching Ruud leave. Night fell on Helios. A teacher was walking down the corridor when he suddenly heard someone say, "If they continue calling him that, trouble will arise. He needs time to avoid the spies peeking in the tower." Then Professor Hale's voice replied, "I will definitely fulfill the contract, but I need a little more time."
The teacher ran into Hale's room and asked what was happening. But Hale answered calmly, as if not even understanding the question. The teacher said there was some kind of shadow here. He actually saw a black shadow. Suddenly, the teacher sensed something strange and turned around in fear. Professor Kai said he would do everything to fulfill the contract. Morning came on Helios. Ruud woke up in bed. She felt like she had slept long enough. As expected, Liorsus was no longer in the room. Meanwhile, Liorsus's bed was neatly made. When Liorsus had left yesterday, no matter how hard Rod tried to talk him out of it, Liorsus had continued to pretend to be asleep. Rod thought it might be too early to share a room with Liorsus. Liorsus was much more cautious than he appeared. Looking out the window, Ruud saw that the courtyard was already bustling. It seemed everyone was up early. The students were chatting animatedly, and Ruud was mentioned in their conversation. She heard that the new student, the one who had gotten a perfect score on the entrance exam, was now sharing a room with a boy. Furthermore, the new student wanted her alone.
Ruth decided that if they were reacting this strongly just because they were roommates, the problem was much more serious than she initially thought. She had to take more proactive action. Suddenly, Ruth saw a group of students from the classroom leading Liorsa somewhere. At the same time, they were acting quite aggressively. The other students saw what was happening, but none of them dared to intervene.
Ruud decided to observe first. Leus was pushed so hard that he fell. One of the students from class could ask, why doesn't Leorsus understand what they're saying? See, descendants like Leorsus, they aren't allowed to walk in the main hall. He has to sneak through another way just so he doesn't appear in front of them. Ardian's family seemed to completely ignore him. Even Leorsus's older brother recently revealed that he didn't have a younger brother. Doesn't that mean everyone has abandoned Leorsus? What a sad sight. One of the students remarked that it was a good thing Leorsus's family didn't care about him. And then he stepped on Leorsus's hand. Another student tried to stop him, but the boy just snapped back. He said Leorsus was just a boy, and when else would they get the chance to do something like this to someone from the Duke's family? He called on his friends to join him in stomping on Leorsus. But then a book fell right on the student's head. The blow was strong enough to knock him straight to the ground. His friends stood there, wondering where did that book even come from. Then a voice came from the wall. It said the book belonged to Ruud. It was Ruud. He politely asked for the book to be returned, and then he jumped down, right on top of them. Leorsus stared in shock. Ruud landed right on top of the second student. He apologized, calmly saying he thought it was the floor. The third student yelled, asking what he was doing. Ruud simply replied that the student was in no position to be asking questions. The student swung his arm angrily, trying to strike, but Ruud, he easily blocked the student's hand.
Ruud smiled, then told student that he had struck first. Leorsus watched in amazement as Ruud countered the attack. The student lost consciousness from the blow. Eventually, the three students from class good lay in front of Ruud and Leorsus. Ruud was surprised. He thought the student was weaker than expected because Ruud hadn't even hit very hard. Meanwhile, Leorsus seized the moment and fled. Ruth stared at the retreating figure. She tried to stop him by calling his name, but Leorsus told her not to come any closer. Ruth didn't stop him. Under the shocked gazes of two passing students, Leorsus continued running. A girl saw the students lying down and rushed to their aid. By then, Ruud had already managed to hide. He thought about Leorsus's words, telling him not to come any closer. Meanwhile, Ruud didn't notice the other students staring at him strangely. He concluded that Leorsus's reaction today was different from yesterday. He wondered where Leorsus had gone and if he should have followed him straight away. But then, Dio pounced on Ruud and dragged him to a secluded spot. When they were alone, Dio asked, "Is it true that Ruud is staying in the same room as that boy?" Ruud replied, "Yes." Dio said gloomily that he should have explained everything to Ruth yesterday. Then he said that for now, Ruud needed to move to another room. Ruud asked, "Why?" Dio replied that it was necessary for Ruud's peaceful school life. Ruud didn't seem to understand the situation he was in. The boy Dio was talking about is the young master of the Ardian family. Ruud said he realized Chevan Hadidelio was behind all this. Then Ruud asked, "Does that justify everything that happened to Leorsus, who was branded as trash and ignored by everyone?"
Leorsus was hiding nearby at the time and overheard the entire conversation. Dio replied that it wasn't like that, and Ruud said he thought so too. Then Ruud asked, "What does Leorsus himself think about it?" Dio looked at Ruth in confusion. Just then Leorsus came out from behind the boxes. Ruth tries to talk to him, but Dio asks, "How long has Leorsus been standing there?" Leorsus walks past without saying a word. He tries to leave, but trips over some boxes and falls. Ruth wants to call out to him, but Dio covers Ruud's mouth with his hand. Dio asks, what does Ruud want to achieve by stopping him? Nothing would change, and Ruud might just end up in Leorsus's position. Leorsus started to leave again. Ruud grabbed his sleeve and called him names. Ruud said, maybe they should talk. But Leorsus snapped that he didn't need anything like that. He pulled his sleeve from Ruud's hand and left. Ruud couldn't understand. What was wrong with Leorsus? Dio asks, what happened to you, Ruud? What exactly did you want to talk to Leorsus about? And why?
Ruud replies that they share the same room, and then asks, why does everyone call Leorsus a brat? What could have happened in the past month that everyone started calling him that? When the other students see Leorsus, they ask, why is he still studying here? They said they would have left a long time ago if they were in his shoes. They said Leorsus was scary. They called him a monster. Little Letis was crying, very bitterly. There was a girl lying at Leorsus's feet. The girl was dead. There was an older child standing nearby. The child looked at Leorsus and said, You were the cause of that girl's death. The horrific memories flooded back into Leorsus's mind. Dio said seriously that he himself didn't know why everyone called young Master Ardian a brat. Ruud said, okay, then he tried to leave, but Dio stopped Ruud. Dio explained that it all started with Jeffley. At first, everything was fine, but after that incident, everyone started calling Leorsus a brat. Ruud asked, what incident? One day, shortly after they entered Helios, many Edenians gathered in the library. On that day, the young Master Guardian was said to have transformed into a terrifying monster, right there. It was said to have 3 eyes, its entire body covered in fur, and its arms divided into 8 parts. Ruud asked, nonsense, Dio, what are you saying? However, Dio replied that he himself was not there. He was only repeating rumors. Ruud thought it was just nonsense. How could Leorsus turn into a monster? But then again, the library was closed for several days after the incident, so something really happened there. Dio said that Ruud needed to move rooms immediately. Rumors of this had already spread throughout Eden and would soon reach Horace. Ruud noticed that everyone's reaction today was different from yesterday. He asked Dio, would you also avoid me if I didn't change rooms? Dio looked at Ruud in surprise. Ruud said, you wouldn't do something like that, Dio. You're not like them. Dio had no choice but to agree. The two of them walked through the school building under the watchful, heavy eyes of everyone around them. Ruud said it seemed like he was still the center of attention. Dio replied grimly, I don't want to be the center of attention. He then asked Ruud what he was planning, since Ruud clearly had no intention of fighting the Koreans. After a brief silence, Red replied, of course not. Dio then asked, but why? Why are you trying so hard to help young Master Ardian? Red replied that it wasn't exactly a favor, but he felt like it had been a chore right from the start. When they entered the classroom, Leorsus was already seated. As usual, he was silently staring at the table. Ruud said that even if nothing had changed, if he didn't do anything, it would be like condoning this injustice. He remembered Dases's words about Leorsus being a lonely child. And for the sake of the child, who was still considered a child and was constantly suffering, Dases was ready to do anything. After entering the classroom, Red turned to Dio. He said they were in the same boat as Leorsus. Leorsus, Dian Art. Although status was considered insignificant in Helios, the Ardian family wasn't something to be taken lightly. Ruud stated he wanted to move and requested that the seat next to Leorsus be vacated. The students looked at each other in confusion. What was he doing? Even the silver-haired girl wondered. If Leorsus had mentioned his family himself, he wouldn't be in this situation, so then why didn't he do anything? Ruud thought this was what he had to face. Now, the 3 of them sat side by side, Leorsus, Ruud, and Dio. According to ancient scriptures left behind by past kings, the mage was the lion god. He was also depicted as a great savior, one who cleansed the polluted land and defeated monsters. In today's world, however, such fame is no longer entirely justified. There are ordinary magicians who are unworthy, obtaining their marks illegally and then simply walking away. However, that doesn't mean they aren't saviors. In this day and age, they are the only ones capable of facing monsters. During class, the students gazed curiously at the trio sitting nearby. Among them was a green-haired girl. After class ended, the students continued to cast curious glances at them, but no one approached. Suddenly, Ruud spoke loudly to Leorsus. Leorsus didn't react at all. He just remained silent. Ruud called out loudly once more, until the entire class could hear him. Hey, Leorsus! Dio suddenly mentioned he was hungry and suggested they eat lunch together. They left, but Leorsus remained in class. During lunch, Dio suggested that Ruud reconsider this. He said that neither of them would change anything.
Besides, he added, if the person in question doesn't care about anything, why should we interfere? He doesn't care whether we're around him or not. Ruth replied that she didn't think so. The book Liorsus had pretended to be reading, it was actually open upside down. In fact, he was very aware of our presence. Dio said gloomily that the friends who used to joke and laugh with Liorsus now wouldn't even look him in the eye. Ruth agreed. It was true. If it's hard for two people to change something, she said, then they just need to find more people to join. Just then, a group of treasures entered the dining room. Rod muttered that it was too late to back out anyway. The treasures stopped right in front of them. Their leader asked, "Is that Rod Christie?" Rod looked her straight in the eyes and replied, "Yes, so what?" One of the treasures, the one with a bandage on his nose, flared up, angry because Rod was being so rude. The leader, Manon, said she hoped Rod would come with her. Rod agreed, and they headed out to the garden. Manon told the others they could go. Her companions left, leaving Manon alone with Rod and Dio. Her face seemed familiar to Rod. Dio leaned in and whispered, "This treasure she was last seen with Helios."
Manon said that Red knew why she brought him here. Red replied that he didn't. She was the one who brought him here, so why even ask about it? Manon said she heard Red was late. That must be true since he was so fearless. Then she immediately declared that Red should stay away from that monster, that bastard. Red was shocked. Monster? He didn't quite understand what Manon meant. Were there actually monsters on Helios? Manon stated that she didn't like wordplay. Was this just sympathy? Or was Red simply satisfied with playing with such a bastard? Red should stop doing this, she said. There's a reason behind every outcome. He should stop getting involved in things he doesn't understand and just focus on his own business. If he stays close to Liorsus, Red will only lose everything and gain nothing. Red asked if Manon was giving him advice. Manon replied that it wasn't advice, she was warning him. Red and Dio sat in the schoolyard. Red sighed, "Then it's a warning." Dio stated that since Manon was saying something like that, they should really just take the simple path. Red asked, "Simple? How?" Dio said, "Forget it." Then he asked, "What will you do next, Red?" "First of all, they need more allies. Not that such a thing will be easy." Red said, "We can think about that later, but for now, we need to gather information and find out what really happened." Dio asked, "How will you find out?" Red replied that the easiest way is to ask Liorsus directly. First, they need to have a normal conversation with him, then think about what to do next, overthrow the cheval, or turn the entire school upside down. Red looked towards the warehouse, where Liorsus usually hides.
But no one was there. Where did he go? Meanwhile, Liorsus was in the professor's office. The professor asked, "Does Liorsus really have no problems in his academic life?" Liorsus replied that he did. The professor said that he knew Diner, and that if there was something bothering Liorsus, he could talk to him, without hesitation. He added that if Liorsus didn't want to help himself, there was nothing the school could do. But Liorsus remained silent. There were many students in the school building. Ruth stopped one of them and politely asked if he had seen Liorsus. But the disciple said he didn't know, and quickly ran away. The other disciples stared at Ruth strangely, wondering why she was looking for descendants, and advising each other not to look her in the eye. Ruth thought that starting a conversation with them was quite difficult. Was she really that disgusting to them? Suddenly, a silver-haired girl said that if Ruth was looking for descendants, then it seems Liorsus had gone to the Western warehouse. She added that Liorsus was carrying a magic box, so she was most likely right. Ruth thanked the girl for the information. The girl's friends immediately surrounded her. They asked why she was even talking to someone like Ruth. Of course they would protect her if anything happened, but one still had to be careful. Ruth turned to the girl and her friends. She said she wasn't looking for Spawn, but for Liorsus. Then she turned and walked away, leaving the girl confused. She had chosen a spot where she could see Liorsus if he had indeed gone to the Western warehouse. Liorsus hadn't appeared for a while, and Ruth thought he might have already left.
Finally! She spotted Liorsus. He was carrying a box of stones. Ruth wanted to call out to him, but she decided it wouldn't be entirely convenient to do it from where she was. She remembered Manon's warning, but after a moment's thought, she decided to ignore the threat. "Liorsus!" she called out, her voice loud enough to echo through the entire courtyard. She waved her hand, shouting for him to wait, telling him she'd be there soon. But Leorsis? He pretended not to hear and just ran. What a rascal, Ruth thought. He was running away, again. She remembered the last time he'd left her like that, and she realized Leorsis was going to avoid her until the very end. So, right there, amidst the shocked gazes of the other students, Ruth jumped down and bolted after him. The students watched the scene in total amazement. One of them turned to Ren, the green-haired girl, and asked, "Wait, did you see that? Did she just jump from that height?" But Ruth didn't stop. She kept chasing him. Around them, the students were whispering, asking each other what was happening and why on earth they were running. Ruth realized, a bit too late, that he'd become quite the spectacle. The thug was running fast, but Ruth was catching up. He quickened his pace, his fingers almost grabbing Leorsis's clothes, when suddenly Leorsis started taking stones from the box, imbuing them with magic and throwing them right back at him. Ruth was stunned. He could use magic? Crack! One of the stones hit him squarely in the forehead. Leorsis actually turned around and apologized for it. Ruth was beyond annoyed. I mean, if he felt so guilty, why didn't he just stop running? Why were they even engaging in this senseless chase? Leorsis simply shouted back, "It's all because you're chasing me."
Ruud replied that Leorsus had started running first. Leorsus, however, said he only ran because the man called out to him. He looked down, and there, down below, Seva von Hadelio was standing with a group of rough figures. Seva looked up, spotting Leorsus standing there. Ruud sighed, saying that Leorsus shouldn't have run away, and suggested they just talk normally. Suddenly, Leos shouted for Ruud to stay away. Ruud stared at him in surprise. Leos added that Ruud should just stay away from him. Then, Ruud picked up a fallen rock and threw it hard at Leorsus's head. Leorsus held the bruised area in amazement. Ruud approached and grabbed Leorsus by the collar. She asked what would Leorsus do if Ruud got that close. Ruud added that he wouldn't do anything to Leorsus. He just wanted to talk. Suddenly, Seva appeared beside them, balancing on the railing. She asked again, did Ruud really want to talk to the boy? Seva placed her foot on Leorsus's back and asked Ruud, what would a man from Eden want to talk to a creature like that? Ruud moved so quickly she was almost invisible. Then, Seva fell right over the guardrail. Leorsus looked terrified, while Ruud stared at Seva with a blank expression. Ruud remarked that the man had bad habits, but his landing was quite good. Ruud suggested that Leorsus get away from there and find a quieter place. Then, a hand landed on Ruud's head. It was Hadelio, and he was angry. He asked Ruud threateningly, "Is Ruud tired of living?" Ruud replied calmly that he still wanted to live, and then politely asked for the hand to be removed from his head. Seva snapped, "How dare Ruud speak so rudely without knowing who he is?" Ruud replied, "Of course I know who the man is, Seva."
Iya asked Leorsus, what happened next? Ruud said, "Isn't he the great and supreme Ceva?" Harias grabbed his hand. Ceva grinned smugly, but gasped as he squeezed the man's hand tightly. Ceva shouted, "Where did this arrogant bastard come from?" Ceva called out to the girl standing among the treasures, "Anna!" The girl threw a magic stone at him. Ceva caught it deftly and said she wasn't generous enough to tolerate Ruud's insolence. Putting a chain with a magic stone around his neck, Ceva said Ruud should use this opportunity to learn what happens when someone is rude to Kuras. Ruud thought it was a high-level magic stone. Was Ceva really trying to use magic with it? Ceva stated that it was too late for regrets. Ruud had to see with his own eyes the magic of the future great magician. Ruud asked Leorsus what he would do now. Leorsus replied that he should call the professor. Red agreed and told Leorsus to go, but Leorsus said it would be better for Red to go. Ceva felt angry, wondering what they were whispering about. Did they not understand the situation? Ceva began to cast a spell. Ruud and Leorsus watched the man intently. Red thought, it's a magic spell. He didn't want things to get out of hand, so he decided to run. Leorsus said he'd already told Ruud not to come near him, and then told Ruud to leave. Leorsus said he'll handle things himself. Ruud stared at him in shock. What was this bastard trying to do, all by himself? Ceva laughed and remarked how touching the scene was. It had been a long time since she last saw Leorsus mutter something like that in front of her. Leorsus was only going crazy because a new student had started paying attention to him. Leorsus replied that it wasn't a problem, he simply had nothing to do with it. Ceva yelled at Leorsus to shut up and pressed her hand to the man's face.
She said that this was the endless nightmare Liorsis wanted, and that she, Cheva, would send him straight to hell. She whispered, "Say, Liorsis, isn't it beautiful? A little girl with golden hair, walking in a meadow, holding flowers in her hands." But then blood appears on her face and on her clothes as she stands right there before you. Suddenly, a monster appeared behind the girl. Fear choked Liorsis' voice as he pleaded, "Please, don't." However, Cheva continued to torment him, her expression utterly merciless. Suddenly, Ruud knocked Cheva down with a sharp elbow strike. He quickly crouched over the unconscious Liorsis while Cheva screamed, "Are you crazy? How dare you interfere?" "What did you do to him?" Ruud demanded. Cheva hissed back. "The monster seemed to have forgotten his own mistakes, so I simply reminded him. Monsters like Liorsis who don't know their place, they should be punished. And you, Ruud, you don't seem to know your place either, so perhaps you should be punished as well." Cheva leaned in closer. "Tell me, do you have memories you'd rather forget? Fears you never want to experience again? I can show them to you, Ruud. All of them, clearly and very, very vividly." Illusion magic. It was clear now. Ruud finally realized who was behind the story of Liorsis transforming into a monster in the library. He wondered, should he take matters into his own hands? Suddenly, a menacing shout rang out. "What are you doing, Cheva von Hudelio?" It was Professor Khan. Cheva glared at Ruud and spat. "Consider yourself lucky." The professor rushed over, bending down to Ruud and the unconscious Liorsis. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently. "Are you in pain?"
Professor Khan sternly asked Cheva, did she understand what had been done to the students from Eden? Ruth continued to pretend, oblivious, thinking that her time had not yet come. But what really happened between these two? A group of curious students tried to overhear what was happening in Professor Hill's office. Ruud was sitting there. Professor Hill said he heard Ruud jump from a high balcony at school yesterday. Was that true? Ruud replied, no. The professor asked, what about the rumors? About you running around campus with Mr. Ardian like crazy? Ruud replied that he hadn't done that either. Hill said that from the start, he also immediately thought the rumors weren't true. He added that Ruud was late for class because he was sick, so of course it was impossible to do such a thing. Ruud thought sheepishly he had completely forgotten about his illness. When the professor asked if he was sure, Ruud immediately agreed. Hill advised him to be careful. It would be foolish to come to school after recovering only to fall ill again. Moreover, he added, if Ruud as an Eden student mishandled Harry, the entire school life would be affected. Ruud walked down the corridor, thinking that he couldn't talk normally with Liorsis again. Then Dio actually bumped into him. What happened? Dio asked. Is it true that you fought with Cheva? Ruud said that they had indeed met. Dio whispered that a strange rumor was spreading around the school, that Ruud was beaten by Cheva while playing passionately with Mr. Ardian. Dio asked, are you okay? You're not hurt anywhere? Ruud replied that he was fine, but Liorsis was not. Dio looked horrified. He's dead? Ruud said, Liorsis is still alive.
Why would Dio bury someone who was still breathing? Ruud added that they could talk about this later, but now we have to go. Dio asked where, and Ruud replied, we are going to see Liorsis. They walked all over the school, but they couldn't find Liorsis anywhere. Ruth decided to check the warehouse again. Dio asked, wouldn't it be better to wait for Liorsis in the classroom? But while checking the warehouse a second time, they saw him. Liorsis was hiding behind some boxes. Dio was surprised. He was actually there. They moved towards him, asking, Liorsis, what are you doing there? Liorsis didn't react as they approached. Ruud suggested, let's talk while we still have the chance. He asked, do you want some candy? Ruud sat next to Liorsis and told him, forget the rumors. Forget that they say you've turned into a monster. Ruud then asked, but why? Why did Cheva von Hudelio call you a monster? Liorsis snapped, it's none of your business. Whatever they call me has nothing to do with you, so leave me alone. He yelled at Ruud, stop caring. Get away. Just stop paying attention to me. Ruud stared at Liorsis in shock. Rat asked, are you really going to let them keep calling you a monster? Are you going to continue living like this? Liorsis replied, yes, because I am a real monster after all.
Ruud said, okay. Then he held out his clenched fist to Liorsis. Liorsis stared at the candy in Ruud's hand in surprise. Ruud said that there was nothing that could be done. If Liorsus didn't want to talk about it, then Ruud should ask Chefa von Hadelio. Why? Because he needed to know why the man called Liorsus a monster, out of pure curiosity. So this wasn't really Liorsus's business. His name was Ruud Christie. He started school a month late due to illness, and he was said to have been weak since childhood. Chefa said that for a man with such a weak physique, Ruud seemed quite cheerful. Anna continued to report that Ruud shared a room with the monster, and the student she was communicating with, Dio, was in the same class. Anna added that Ruud is the first person to ever get a perfect score on the entrance exam. Chefa asked, "Is that why he's acting like a boss here?" Ruud boasting about simply passing a few exams. Anna asked what they were going to do next. Chefa said that of course they had to make sure Ruud couldn't get back up again, and he threw a magic stone on the table. Thick black smoke poured out of the stone. Soon the smoke stopped. A black cloud floated across the schoolyard. Slowly the cloud transformed into a sinister black shadow and then vanished. However, the figure standing on the balcony noticed something strange flying past. It was Lady Tessiana. She wondered what it was, but Tessiana's attention was diverted by the voice of a child calling out to her, "Tessie!" The man sitting at the table with the girl said the princess shouldn't play with food. The girl said Roma had asked her not to call her princess. The man replied, then the girl shouldn't call Lady Tessiana Tessie either. Roma reminded her that she wasn't Tessie in this place. Night fell on Helios. Master asked how Ruud was doing at school and if he had made any friends. Ruud sat on the roof communicating with Master using a magic stone. Ruud replied that such things were unimportant. He then remarked that Liorsus didn't seem particularly eager to be helped and asked him not to worry too much about him.
If Liorsus himself didn't want help, then Ruud couldn't do anything either. Perhaps it would be best to end this mission? The master replied that he never asked for help under any circumstances, but that didn't mean he didn't want help at all. To that, Ruud replied that he simply didn't know. It seemed Liorsus had his own reasons unknown to them. However, the children here were truly strange. They acted as if they had been hypnotized into calling Liorsus a monster, avoiding and ignoring the young man entirely. It seemed this whole situation was orchestrated by Chef von Hadelio from the senior class. The master asked again, "Hadelio?" Ruud asked, "Does the master know him?" The master replied that of course he knew about Hadelio. It was an ancient noble family that had long since given birth to many powerful magicians. The head of the family, Maris Hadelio, was right at the center of the imperial nobility and lived an active, brilliant life. Maris Hadelio and Duke Arten were known for their feud. Perhaps their personal feud stemmed from a family conflict? Ruud said it wasn't actually a feud, but rather a one-sided suffering experienced by Liorsus. The master suggested that maybe Liorsus had done something wrong. Perhaps he stole a girl, or maybe Cheval lost something valuable because of the young man. The master said that he would try to find out more about the two of them anyway. He also told Ruud that he shouldn't take everything too seriously. While the assignment was important, Ruud should also enjoy school life. For example, making friends or at least trying to make friends with someone. However, Ruud had already severed the magic connection.
Red decided he needed to observe the house a little longer. The house stood on the edge of the sea, right at the edge of a high, rocky cliff. Suddenly, a hand gripped the railing surrounding the house from the seaside. Shortly after, a young man with a rather strange appearance appeared. He explained why Mrs. Rubier had chosen this particular spot for her home. It turned out that the woman not only lacked the sense of style to fit in, but also needed to change her hot temper. She placed her hand on the door and, suddenly, she was inside. She greeted Mrs. Ruby and announced that Elsibel had arrived. However, the room contained only a giant fish. Elsibel breathed a sigh of relief. It seems Mrs. Ruby isn't here. The giant fish reports that Mrs. Rubier has left for a while. Elsibel remarks that the human world seems to be more interesting than she thought. The fish asks if Elsibel swam across the sea and then tells her to stay away because of the smell of sea fish. Elsibel is annoyed. The smell of sea fish is here? Well, of course, it's a giant fish. Elsibel asked why he was in this form, even though Ruby had told him to get used to his human form. The fish replied that he felt stuffy.
Elcibel said it was no wonder he felt stuffy being locked up and suggested he find something fun to do. The fish replied that unlike Elcibel, he hadn't come here on vacation. Elcibel laughed evilly and then suddenly grabbed the fish by the tail. She said that as a teammate, she couldn't ignore her friend's complaints. Elcibel dragged the fish to the window. Then, with a shout of "Fly!" she threw the giant fish off the cliff.
Fish plunged deep into the sea. Elcibel asked, "Does it feel better having emerged from the sea in human form?" A rather menacing man remarked that Elcibel's contemptible and rude nature hadn't changed, not even in this place. Elcibel simply remarked that the man was still as dull and rigid as ever. Elcibel called her interlocutor a gamat, adding that people like him are called fish here. A young horned girl watched them. Ruby Amter asked what they were doing here, even though she had told them to sit quietly. However, Ruby saw a letter stating that the infiltration of Helios Magic Academy was successful, and that finally calmed her down. Everything went according to plan. Morning arrived at the Helios Special Magic School. Professor Lel, Professor Khan called out loudly, but she didn't answer. Then, Professor Khan saw Professor Halil. He approached him and asked if he had seen Professor Lel. Professor Halil replied that no, he hadn't seen her today. Professor Halil continued with his work. Professor Khan asked, "Is that the teleporter that will be used in the upcoming training in Eden?" He noted that the device looked quite complicated and asked, "Is this your work, Professor Halil?" Halil answered that it was. Professor Khan said he had heard that a tower would be used this time and that the training would be held in that specific training room. If the teleporter was like this, then this training session would definitely be extraordinary. Professor Halil replied that since this was the first practical training session of the year, it had to be carried out properly, without incident or mishap. As expected of a teleportation master, Professor Khan remarked. Just then, Dio placed a blue notebook on the table.
Rod asks what it is. Dio says it's valuable information. Information he's worked so hard to gather. He adds that this journey, it hasn't been easy. All the boys avoid him, and when he tries to talk, they simply ignore him. Ruud checks to see if everyone listed here actually has the ability to fight Sheva. Dio replied that it wasn't exactly like that. He only selected nobles and students who showed outstanding results. Ruud looked at Dio doubtfully. Dio, clearly annoyed, said he had done his absolute best to figure everything out. A green-haired girl, Ren, was watching their conversation closely. Even her friend noticed. Dio said that the others on the list might not be as important, but these two, they were definitely useful. First was Utarnan Maria Kanal. She was the only representative of the imperial family on Helios. At school, she was called a princess. With the school's permission, an imperial guard bodyguard was always with her. Even the teachers were afraid to challenge the girl. If she became Prince Arton's ally, then Sheva would be nothing. Dio asked, did anyone hear them? Ruud replied that no one had heard them, even though in reality, everyone around them could hear them perfectly clearly. The students began to discuss the two of them, whispering as if they were plotting something. And ever since Ruud Christie appeared, they hadn't had a single day of peace. They were already in the same class as the monster, and now these two were involved. They were sure to be dragged into it and suffer for no reason. The green-haired girl's friends were annoyed. If they just treated the monster normally, they would be the first to fawn over it.
The girl expressed her frustration with Ren, but Ren, he remained silent. Ruud asked, "Who's the second?" Dio replied that the second person was Lapis Yuan Nadal, Duke Nadal's only son. He was influential, even within the school, and unlike Leorsus, Lapis was the sole heir. Duke Nadal and Cheva had entered Helios at the same time, but their relationship is strained. Now, they're simply ignoring each other. Rod suggests that if Lapis doesn't like Cheva, it'll be easier to approach him. Dio agrees, but points out that there's one small problem. Since joining Helios, Lapis hasn't been able to rank up in Eden. Dio explains that the most likely cause is, well, a lack of skill. In theory, Lapis always held the top spot, but when it came to practical magic, the young man lacked skill. Despite this, he was popular as the Duke's heir, and he despised Cheva, so perhaps he would be useful. Dio mentioned he wanted to find someone normal among those who studied decoration, but it was impossible to approach those people. Dio said that for now, it was just these two. Suddenly, two of Treasure's students entered their classroom. They demanded everyone's attention. The students were surprised to see Treasure there. Treasure's students announced that they had come to deliver a message from Professor Ubinos, the one who was supposed to be teaching the next lesson. In place of the planned lesson, there would be preparations for the upcoming practical training. Therefore, everyone was ordered to move to the East Lecture Hall. Ruud thought to himself he wasn't too confident about the practical training. Then, Ruud noticed that Leorsis wasn't in his seat. Where else could he have gone? Meanwhile, Leorsis sat with his back against the wall, in the narrow hallway.
He had just been splashed with water. One of the treasure members remarked that the wet red look suited the monster prince perfectly. He added that they wanted to remind Leorsus that having a few fools on his side wouldn't change his position. Then Manalon appeared and ordered them to stop. He said that today's goal wasn't to mock this monster. That much was clear. Then another clan member approached and whispered something in Manon's ear. Manon smiled and thought, since the stage was set, it was time to bring the monster there. Meanwhile, Ruud continued searching for Leorsus. Dio said they'd done everything they could and suggested calling off the search. There was no one in the dormitory or the warehouse. Prince Ardian wasn't anywhere else, and because of that, they were already late for class. Ruud asked, where could he have gone? He was clearly still in class this morning. Dio thought Prince Ardian might be sleeping soundly, resting somewhere. Dio said he had to go to the Grand Auditorium. If he got punished for being late, it would be over. Every point was crucial for him. Ruud agreed to stop searching and go to class. However, she had a bad feeling about all this. The students were gathered in the large auditorium, but the professor wasn't there. Only the members of class stood on the stage. They were whispering to each other about what was going on. Where are you, Professor? Shouldn't there be a lesson right now? Then, why are there students from CLED here? Manon stepped forward and asked, are all the students from Professor Hale's group here? After receiving an affirmative answer, she said, since all the main participants are gathered, then let's begin.
The classroom was empty. Professor Ubenos looked around the empty room in surprise. He wondered where everyone had gone. Dio had been saying how important this lecture was, that all the doors had been closed. It was truly suspicious. Ruud thought the even stranger thing though was that Dio knew about this secret entrance. Dio led them to a small door and said, looks like they'll have to crawl. Manon spoke to the students from Eden. She showed them the manus and explained that until the trainees became official mages, they wouldn't be able to use magic without the manus or the stone. Therefore, the first thing they were taught was how to activate the mana within the sapphire. Manifesting mana is the most basic and crucial skill. So today, they would receive a special lesson as part of their preparation. Manon said this lesson was held specifically to demonstrate how they could activate mana. One of the students asked, does the professor know about this? Manon remained silent. Two members of the class approached the student who asked, while the other student stared in fear. They led the student out of the hall. Manon asked, does anyone else have anything else to say? The students immediately fell silent. Manon said, then he will explain first about the manus they will be using. These spheres are made for testing purposes and should not be used for anything other than magic demonstrations. If you manifest mana into the sapphire, the color will change according to each skill. The better one uses the mana, the brighter the light, and the stronger the power contained within.
However, there might only be a slight color change. The assessment would be based on the power behind the SFIR. To do this, they would conduct target practice. At Menon's signal, two clan members pushed out a target where Leorsus was chained. This target, it had received special treatment. The target won't take damage unless it's powered by mana. Therefore, what you need to do is this. Manifest mana into a sphere and then throw it at the target, Manon said. That's all they'll do in this lesson. The students whispered in surprise. She wanted them to throw mana at Leorsus. Of course, Manon said. There's nothing funny about throwing sphere for no reason. Therefore, whoever hits the head gets a bonus point. The clan members poured Manon's sphere from the box. The sphere rolled to the students' feet. Manon asked, who wants to be the first? She looked around the room. Then her gaze changed. Manon shouted angrily that the person wasn't here. She grabbed her assistant and demanded to know why wasn't he there. Dio peeked out from behind cover and noticed what was happening. Rod, standing behind him, asked, "Has class started yet?" "Shh!" Dio hissed at Rod to come back. "Something strange is going on, and the professor must be called." Manon frowned in annoyance. One of the class members asked, what should they do next? Because they've gone too far. Manon replied that they should continue, according to plan. She thought grimly to herself that she had carried out all of this without Chevel's knowledge.
However, things didn't go according to plan. Elle stared thoughtfully at the manosphere in her hand. Clet asked, "Does anyone have the courage to be the first?" If no one else had, then she would have to choose herself. She pointed to the girl who was pressing her hands to her chest. Clet told her to go first and handed her the sapphire. The girl stared in fear and whispered that she couldn't. Then Clet asked, "Is it possible that the girl wants to be a target?" The girl turned to her friends for help, but they remained silent and looked away. The girl took the manuscript and began to concentrate. The manuscript in her hand glowed faintly. Clet said, as expected, the color hadn't changed much. He stated that the next step was the most important. Since the girl was first, he would give her extra points if she managed to hit the monster. The girl gathered her strength and threw the manosphere. However, the sphere didn't even reach the stage. It fell to the floor. Clet declared the girl disqualified. He believed that things were not going as they should, and that the situation needed to be corrected. He shouted to his colleague to set an example. The colleague activated the manosphere and threw it at the target. The sphere struck Leorsus squarely in the head. The students were terrified. Clet said, "Good, everyone has seen how it's done." He asked, "Who's ready to be next?" Dio, who was watching the scene from behind cover, whispered, "Damn bastards." He turned to Ruud and told him to quickly call the teachers, but Ruud had already disappeared. Who knows where?
Suddenly, a hand went up in the crowd of students. The clique members stared, surprised at the person who raised it. It was Rat, and he said he wanted to be next. Everyone was shocked by the sudden statement. Manon thought to herself, has the real Rat Christie finally appeared? Yale, too, couldn't understand what the man was trying to do. The clique members on stage nodded. "Good," they suggested. "Why don't you try it?" Rat took out his manosphere and prepared. Cleet started to say, "If you can hit the monster," but before he could even finish his sentence, his gaze froze in shock. The sphere Rat launched tore a massive hole right through the target. All the Cleet members, including Manon, were stunned. Yale was speechless. Dio's eyes widened. He just couldn't comprehend what Rat was doing. Leorsus glanced at the hole in the target, the one that had appeared right next to his head. Rat sighed, exclaiming in disappointment, "Oh man, I missed." Manon whispered under her breath, "This is impossible." Leorsus felt the chains binding his body begin to loosen right after the impact. Rat raised another manosphere. He expressed his regret for missing. "Can I try again?" he asked. He began to generate his energy, declaring that this time he would definitely hit the target. The manosphere in Rat's hand glowed brightly. Then suddenly it cracked under the shocked gaze of the audience. The sphere shattered into tiny pieces. "Maybe it's defective," Rat muttered as he reached for another one. The clique member in charge tried to stop him, but Rat didn't listen. Instead, he turned to Leorsus. Rat looked him in the eye and said, "I'm serious. If you don't want to get hit, you'd better get out of the way."
With those words, he threw the sapphire. The disciples watched in amazement. Leorsus lunged, but missed, and fell off the target. Instead, the sphere struck Clat squarely in the forehead. Rod apologized. The other members stared silently at their fallen comrade. Rod asked, "Why is that guy even standing there? How awkward." Dio, who was watching from behind cover, thought that from the very start he had sensed that Rod was no ordinary person. The students froze in shock. Isel whispered, "Rod Christie? Who is he?" Manon couldn't believe her own eyes. The sapphire had penetrated the target completely. Even she herself couldn't leave a single scratch on it. Furthermore, Rod's sapphire was nearly the color of a snake. How could someone from Eden manifest such a color? Manon was confused. Perhaps it was some kind of trick, though it couldn't really be called a trick either. Who was this person? Rubbing his shoulder, Rod said things were going badly. The target is broken. It's also no longer centered. How about choosing a new target? The students froze at the mention of a new target. Ruud explained that, for example, the new target could be the person who put on this unpleasant show, or one of his loyal henchmen. Or, he added, what if the person who created this special class became the training target? Ruud said it would be interesting, wouldn't it? Manon was furious. The brat was talking about a new goal. She shouted that from now on, she would personally choose a target, and that target was Ruud Christie. Capture that boy, Manon screamed. Dio, watching from his hiding place, realized he couldn't just stand by anymore. He had to help.
Dio immediately ran forward, but someone grabbed his collar from behind. It was Professor Raoul. Dio delighted to see her and tried to explain the situation, but the woman shushed him. Dio was shocked. What are you going to do?" he asked. She simply replied that she was observing. Dio felt irritated and tried to say something, but Professor Raoul covered his mouth with his hand. She was observing everything happening in the classroom intently. Meanwhile, Ruud launched a sapphire at one of the treasures, hitting it squarely in the face. The student fell to the ground, motionless. The remaining treasure students immediately rushed to stop Ruud, trying to prevent him from lifting the sapphire. They even managed to catch him, but Ruud punched one of the students holding him, and then kicked another, sending him flying. Ruud glared at the third treasure, and the student backed away in fear. Ruud apologized, but he was in a bad mood today, so he shouldn't be taken advantage of. The Eden disciples were shocked by the scene. Manon asked her assistant, "Is the sapphire still there?" Her assistant replied that many people were already lying on the floor. Manon sighed. She didn't need an experimental sapphire. She needed a genuine one that could actually be used. However, the student replied that they only had a trial spell. Manon took it out. She realized then that Ruud Christie was clearly no ordinary person. Manon asked everyone present and declared, anyone who can hit Ruud Christie will receive a reward. At the same time, she activated her own spell and threw it straight at Ruud.
Ruud calmly stared at the sapphire, floating toward him. But suddenly, Leorsus ran toward him. He shielded him from the attack with his own body. Ruud was surprised that a man who seemed so cold, so indifferent like Leorsus, would react in such a way. "Why?" Ruud asked. "Why did you take the attack in my place?" Manon screamed in anger. "Monster!" She turned to the people around her. "Why are you just standing there like idiots? Throw the sapphires! Throw them at there!" Professor Raoul, however, remained calm, simply watching the scene unfold. "Leorsus, how are you?" Ruud asked. "Are all your bones still intact?" The remaining clad students picked up the sapphires, preparing to hurl them at Ruud and Leorsus. "Leorsus," Ruud said, "I want to confirm one thing. Do you have some strange hobby? Or do you just enjoy being bullied?" "It's not that," Leorsus replied irritably. "Well, that answer is quite a relief," Ruud said. "But then, why are you protecting me? Since you asked me to stop caring about me, you shouldn't care whether I'm attacked or not. That way, it would be fair to both of us." Leorsus looked away. "This is all my fault. I can't let anyone suffer because of me." At that moment, one of them hurled a sapphire at them. Ruud pushed Leorsus away and caught the sapphire with his bare hand. "What exactly are you talking about?" Ruud asked. "None of this is your fault." The clad students froze in shock. They stared at Ruud, unable to believe he had actually caught it. The crux of the matter, added, is actually quite simple.
He simply hated people like them. One of the treasures shouted for them to throw a sapphire at Ruud. However, the sapphire Ruud launched first hit his comrade, knocking him straight to the ground. Ruud dodged the sapphire that flew at him and began counting the enemies he had defeated. The one just now, that was the first. He dropped the treasure, the one who had been telling everyone to throw sapphires at him, thinking to himself, that's the second one. Another treasure shouted in annoyance, asking what on earth the boy was doing. A third, a fourth. Ruud just kept counting. He wondered how many people were left and where Leorsis was now. Meanwhile, Leorsis stood in front of the Eden crowd and received the sapphire that flew towards them. Ruud was amazed. What was that fool doing? The other students stared at Leorsis in confusion. Suddenly, Ren shouted, "Leorsis is bleeding!" Ren ran over to him and began untying the bones on Leorsis' hands. In a barely audible voice, Ren whispered, "I'm sorry." Leorsis stared at Ren, confused. Meanwhile, Ruud struck another treasure. He wondered, Was it the 11th or the 12th? Ruud remarked that it seemed like they were the only ones left. He looked up at the stage where Manon stood with two of her subordinates. They stared at Ruud, contemplating what to do now. Ruud slowly walked toward them. Manon was confused by his appearance. Almost all of the treasure line had been defeated. She even wondered if she was dreaming. Ruud arrived almost directly in front of the stage.
She smiled sweetly and asked if they would continue. Ren walked over to Leorsus and apologized again. He tried to talk to Leorsus, but a hand stopped him. It was Ren's friend who tried to pull him away from Leorsus. Ren looked at his friend and then at the other classmates. Ren asked them, how long? How long were they going to keep doing this? Did they really think Leorsus was a monster? Ren said he wasn't perfect himself, but their treatment, it was too cruel. Ardian hadn't done anything to them. Why were they treating him like this? Was it because they were afraid of a high school student? Ren said he didn't know how powerful Heras or Clat were, but they couldn't let those people trample on everyone. Ren couldn't finish his sentence, however, as a body was thrown right past him. Ren stared at the person in horror. The other students gasped. Another treasure fell at their feet. Leorsus looked up at the stage. Only Ruud and Manon remained standing there. Manon shouted, "Does Ruud really think he can fight them all? Shefet will definitely do something to Ruud and the monster." Ruud said coldly that he was fed up with all the talk about monsters. He said that there were people who were bullied but had no way to fight back. And then there were people who gathered in groups just to scare someone who was helpless. Ruud asked Manon who did she think was the real monster among them. Then Ruud answered his own question. The monster was Manon. Suddenly, a loud scream was heard from Dio. "Ruud!" Ruud turned towards the scream and saw it, a bright shining sphere shooting toward him.
Ruud dodged it. Easily. The spear hit Manon squarely on the forehead. The students gasped. Manon fell, leaving only Ruud standing on the stage. Ruud didn't understand what had just happened or who threw the last spear. In the sudden silence, someone's footsteps were heard. Ruud felt like he'd seen that person somewhere. It was Professor Raoul. Ruud remembered meeting him at the auction house. Ruud had fought with Professor Raoul and Shikmuan. Ruud was shocked to realize that the woman was a professor at Helios were relieved. It turned out to be Professor Raoul who had thrown the sphere. They were safe. Professor Raoul turned to Ruud. He asked why he had dodged it. Ruud stared at the woman, not understanding what he meant. Taking out a new sphere, Professor Raoul remarked that Ruud could have easily deflected the sphere, but he had dodged it instead. Dio couldn't believe what he was seeing. Professor Raoul was preparing to throw the sphere. Again! Professor Raoul told Ruud not to dodge this time. He was intrigued. Ruud tried to stop him. Suddenly, another professor entered the hall. Professor Halil asked, "What is going on here?" He saw Professor Raoul holding the manosphere in his hand. Professor Han shouted at Professor Raoul, asking what he was doing. Professor Han looked around and found the target, completely penetrated. Also, the trainees were lying on the floor. Many of them were unconscious. Professor Han asked Raoul in shock, "Did you really do all this?" Dio held his head.
What exactly was going on? He looked towards the stage and saw Ruud lying there right next to the target. Professor Hill ordered someone to call a medic and then ordered the students to return to their respective classes. Professor Raoul just stared at Ruud thoughtfully. Helio Magic School was the Eden students' study area. The students in Eden's class stared at the unusual visitor with curiosity. Lapis irritably remarked to her interlocutor that everyone was staring at her now. She then asked how long she would be here and if it was finally time to return to her own territory. Her interlocutor was a student from Caris's class. She said that their attention was most likely not on her. He also asked Lapis where her territory was. She stated simply that all of Helios was their territory. Heras mentioned that during a private training session, she saw a small hoopie. The hoopie was so cute that it seemed strange it would eventually grow into such a terrifying monster. Lapis was annoyed. She thought Hera was just showing off for being able to participate in private training. Caris said it was time for Lapis to tell her how she met the Black Mage. Lapis hissed at Caris to keep her voice down. She said she already told her there was nothing important about the meeting. She simply met the Black Mage by chance. That was all. Caris, however, said she wanted to hear everything in great detail. Who was Black Mage? What did he like? His hobbies, his clothing style, and his favorite food. Lapis wearily asked him, "What is it you really want to achieve in the end?" He replied that the black magician was someone he greatly admired. He had asked Opian several times just to meet him.
But every time, the request was rejected. It was as if the authorities were deliberately filtering out all such requests. For that reason, she also wanted to meet him, by chance. Lapis was lost in the memory of the moment they teleported from the auction. The girl who accompanied the black mage, if I'm not mistaken, her name was Ren, was annoyed and said that she would definitely discuss the situation with the master. Lapis and Runa watched them. Ren asked Blow if he was injured, and Blow replied that he was perfectly fine. They were about to leave, but Lapis asked them to wait. Ren and the black mage turned their heads in surprise. Lapis then reflected, an opportunity like this, it only came once in a lifetime. She told the black mage that it might sound strange, but she wanted to learn from him. The black mage stared at her, surprised. Lapis confirmed it. She truly wanted to become the black mage's disciple. The path ahead might be difficult, but her dream was to one day become as powerful as the black mage, and she would do anything to avoid tarnishing her teacher's reputation. But then, Ren stopped her. She said that such a thing was impossible. Lapis looked at Ren questioningly. Ren explained that Opian members were to focus solely on their mission, and were forbidden from accepting apprentices. Lapis had no choice but to accept the rejection. Now, she recalls the story with shame. Why did he open his mouth at that moment? Had he truly gone mad? Hideo entered the hall with his men. Lapis greeted him, and Anna. Hideo asked, in surprise, if he was still in touch with the student from Eden, the one who had sunk to the bottom. Lapis said those words came from someone who played games with power.
So, which of them had sunk lower? The other person turned to Helios, saying that Lapis had called him a child. Helios simply replied that he was pathetic, and that he wouldn't waste his time dealing with someone like him. He called Anna and the others, and then he left. Lapis asked gloomily, "Who is the pathetic one here? How long will this go on?" The other person asked what she was talking about. It really bothered him. In one of the schoolrooms, Professor Khan and Professor Raoul were questioning Liorsis and Ruud about the incident that had just occurred. Professor Khan said that they might not believe it, but if they listened to the students, the damage to the target and what had happened to the high school students were the work of one person. He approached Rod Christie and asked, "Is that true?" Rod replied that he didn't understand what Professor Khan meant. Professor Raoul watched him intently and then suddenly asked, "He's a magician, isn't he?" Liorsis stared at Professor Raoul in surprise. Ruth lowered her head into her hands, thinking frantically about what to do. Professor Khan asked what nonsense Professor Raoul was talking about. If Christie really was a magician, why was she acting like this? Rod wondered if he had been acting too carelessly all this time. It seemed Professor Raoul had sensed something, even though he hadn't even used any mana. Professor Raoul continued to observe him intently. Ruth said her head hurt terribly. Professor Khan became worried and said she needed to go to the infirmary, but Raoul snapped, "Ruth is fine." Khan asked how Professor Raoul knew. After all, Professor Raoul had been the one to bring the medicine when Ruth fell. Ruth said weakly, I don't understand what you want from me." He was so shocked to see the ball flying towards him that he didn't remember anything else. Professor Raoul sharply reprimanded him for lying, and Liorsus's eyes widened at those words. Professor Khan announced that Professor Hale would now punish the students involved in this incident. However, until the matter was resolved, they could return to class. Ruud decided that he seemed to have gotten away with it, at least for now. Professor Raoul continued to stare at him. Ruud stared back, thinking that something interesting was about to happen. A group of students with grimaced faces stood in front of Cheva. Cheva asked what was wrong with their faces. They tried to answer, but suddenly they saw something and froze. Cheva was annoyed. Why was everyone acting so strangely? She followed their gazes and saw Ruud and Liorsus walking. Liorsus saw her too. Cheva called out to them rudely. Ruud Christie looked at her expressionlessly, and then he smiled. Cheva was shocked. What exactly is going on? She muttered. Liorsus asked Ruud what he was doing, but Ruud simply grabbed Liorsus' shoulder and they passed right by Cheva and her entourage. Cheva just stood there, watching them go. Ruud and Liorsus walked down the corridor. Suddenly, Liorsus stopped. Ruud turned and asked what had happened. Liorsus said that from now on, much more could happen because of him. A figure appeared in Liorsus' mind, saying that he himself must understand that he brought only misfortune. Liorsus told Ruud that he would only bring him suffering. Ruud replied, "Are you cursing me or something?" He asked, "Did you even see what happened earlier?" Liorsus wasn't the type to say such things, but even if there were 100 of them, it meant nothing.
Then, if something happens, it's not Liorsus' fault. Then, Rat won't have any problems either. Therefore, Liorsus should stop worrying about others and finally start thinking about himself. How will Liorsus continue to live with such a gentle nature? Liorsus replies that Ruud doesn't know everything. Rat agrees he doesn't know what Liorsus is thinking or what's going on. And it seemed Liorsus wasn't willing to share it, even when asked. But Liorsus could ask for help, and he couldn't just tell Ruud to ignore him. Whatever the problem, Rat would help. Liorsus couldn't understand why Rat was doing all this. He told Rat he didn't need Rat's help and turned to leave. Rat laughed, saying he was well aware of that, but Liorsus had already run away from him, again. Eden classroom at Helios School of Magic. Most of the students looked confused. One of the girls voiced the general opinion, asking, "What will happen to us now?" The student next to her added that because of this incident, not only Cloud but Karasei had also started ignoring them. Dio watched the students' reactions gloomily. Why were they dragged into all this? It was all because of that monster. Why did everyone have to suffer because of just one person? Now all the other students avoided them, like insects. The girl suggested she could ask the professor to transfer them to another class, but someone else muttered that it would be better to just stop him from coming to their class at all. Dio couldn't help himself and asked annoyedly, "What are you even talking about?" Suddenly, Ren stepped forward and loudly ordered everyone to be quiet. The students stared at Ren in absolute amazement.
Ren asked, "Why? Why were they all so selfish and so self-centered? Was it just because they felt uncomfortable being avoided? When they were treated the exact same way they treated Ardian, how did they think he felt? They thought it was all Ardian's fault. They called him a monster and they avoided him. But everyone knew the truth. They were just like those people." Ren insisted that Ardian was also human and that he had feelings. A student denied it, claiming she hadn't seen what happened that day in the library when the monster appeared. But how? How could they pretend nothing happened? Ren hesitated to answer, but then another girl stepped in and said it was all illusion magic. Yel said she'd heard Chevi was skilled in illusion magic and that she possessed quite the monosphere. Since Chevi was so skilled, it wasn't difficult for her to show them that illusion. If there was something wrong with Ardian, he wouldn't be on Helios, she argued. If they had used even a little brain power, they would have realized it long ago. The students fell silent after hearing Yel's words. E added that they were just using the excuse that Ardian was a monster, but the truth was, they were just afraid of Cheva and Harry. One student was offended, snapping that Islate thought too highly of herself when she was no better than any of them.
Isel agreed that she was just like them, but now the situation had changed. They might have been so shocked that they'd forgotten about Ruud Christie, but they could change things. The students listened to Aile's words in shock. Suddenly, they realized that Leorsus was among them. Leorsus' sudden appearance frightened many. Ruud Christie followed him into the room, asking, "Why are you still acting like that?" Dio immediately ran to him. "Is everything okay?" Ruud froze, not understanding what he had done to attract everyone's attention. However, Dio cut him off. "I wasn't asking about you, Ruud. I was asking about the treasure and what the professors were saying." Ruud replied, "The professors were talking too much. I didn't really understand what they were saying." "I feel a little dizzy," Ruud started to say, but Dio cut him off again. "I told you, I'm not asking about you. I'm asking about the treasure. What were the professors saying?" He replied again that they had been talking too much, and he hadn't really understood a word.
Leorsus tried to take the opportunity to escape, but Ruud held him back. Ale turned to them and said, "Monsters." She immediately corrected herself. "I mean, those are Leorsus and Ruud Christie." She extended her hand to them. "My name is Ale Floren Chrome." Leorsus remained silent, unmoving, but Ruud shook the outstretched hand. Another student joined in the conversation. "I'm Nidon," he said, "and if it isn't too late, I hope we can get along."
Then they asked how Ruud could penetrate magic targets and whether, if they trained hard, they could become just like him. Ruud was told that he used to be very difficult to approach. Then they asked again, how could he penetrate magic targets, and if they trained hard, could they become like him too? The pair of students who had started the unpleasant conversation were confused. They were confused about their own thoughts and the point of communicating with Ruud. Several students approached Dardian. They reminded him of how he had stopped the magic ball in the lecture hall, and then they thanked him for it. Ruud watched everything unfold with satisfaction. He thought the outcome was much better than he had initially expected. Meanwhile, Manon was in the medical room. Cheva and Anna sat beside the bed. Cheva asked Manon why she was doing all this. She never asked Manon to do anything like that. Manon apologized, saying she would take responsibility for everyone. Cheva interrupted and said, "Good, since it's already happened, there's nothing we can do. So Manon, keep that in mind." Cheva remembered telling Professor Hayil that she had nothing to do with the incident. Professor Hayil said that he believed Cheva, but Cheva should understand that if the situation was like this, then there was nothing wrong with extending the punishment for Manon and the rest of the gang according to the rules and regulations. Cheva asked directly, "What does Professor Hayil want?" The professor looked satisfied that Cheva understood his intentions so well. Cheva didn't know what Professor Hayil was planning, but this was the perfect opportunity to show off his own abilities to whoever challenged him. Cheva said he heard that Eden was planning to hold an external training and would be bringing some students with him.
Cheva had no idea what Professor Hill was planning, but this was the perfect opportunity to show off his skills to anyone who challenged him. Manon turned to Cheva again. She muttered that this was all because of that damn Rudy. No matter how much she thought about it, Ruud was clearly no ordinary student. Because of this, Manon decided that Cheva had to know. Hideo asked, "Did Manon hit her head too hard?" He told her to be careful, especially with one of the children from Eden. Anna tried to calm the situation, telling Manon not to worry about small things and to just stop dwelling on the matter. Cheva, however, just smiled, saying she'd tell them some exciting news soon. Later, Ruud and Leorsis were in their room. Ruud lay awake, wondering, had he done everything right? He looked over at Leorsis, who was fast asleep. Even then, it felt like Leorsis was beginning to communicate with them somehow. Ruud stared at him, thinking to himself, "I still don't know what's going on in this man's head." Suddenly, black smoke seeped into their room through the window. It began to gather, swirling near Leorsis's bed, until the smoke formed a strange black figure. It whispered, "This is about to happen." Ruud immediately jumped up, trying to catch the figure. "Who are you?" he demanded. The face seemed familiar to him, but just like that, the figure vanished. The black smoke was gone, without a trace. Ruud wondered, what was that thing, and what was it doing to Leorsis? It seemed unlikely to be the same as the cheflet problem. But then, what had happened to that person? Either way, the atmosphere was changing. The students were actually excited. They were about to face a monster soon. All anyone could talk about was the upcoming field training exercise.
They were excited because they were about to face a monster. Ruud and Leorsis also came out of the room. Ruud hadn't slept well, not after that black shadow incident, and he yawned just a little. Two students saw them and called out a greeting. Leorsis glanced at them, then passed them silently. Then Ruth approached, greeting them with a sweet smile. Ruth tried to talk to Leorsis about what happened last night. She even told him that when someone greets him, he should really greet them back. She tried to bring up the events again, but Leorsis only gave her a puzzled look. "Everything is fine," Ruth sighed. "It doesn't matter." But he kept thinking about it. Yesterday's incident. He was sure it was magic, but the magic had disappeared without a trace. It was unlikely Leorsis knew anything about this, though. Ruud remembered the figure saying something was about to happen. He sensed danger. Should he tell the school? Maybe, but he had no proof. Ruud decided he should discuss this with the master first.
He snapped out of his reverie and suddenly saw Liorsis standing right there. Ruud asked if Liorsis had been waiting for him, since he'd stopped walking. Yesterday, Liorsis had been avoiding him. Now, it seemed his opinion had changed. Ruth heard someone calling her and saw Dio running towards them. Ruth told Liorsis he should greet him, so Liorsis looked at Dio and said, "Hello." Dio thought the scene looked quite funny from the outside. More classmates approached them then, telling Ruth that Professor Raoul was looking for her and that he would most likely be back soon. Dio agreed.
He and Liorsis walked ahead. Then Ruth asked Dio if he would join them. Dio agreed. The three of them walked on, debating who would be the first to enter the classroom. Professor Hale informed the class that the gang involved in the recent incident would be dealt with strictly according to the rules. He hopes that incidents like this will not happen again in the future, and that this whole incident will only remain a bad memory. Helios will also take additional measures to improve training, so students can focus on preparing for the on-site training. Professor Hale added, however, that they don't really know what might happen there. After class, the three of them sat in the cafeteria. Dio gloomily remarked that they might have to prepare for a monster encounter. Ruth suggested they might have to defeat a specially trained monster, but Dio, he said it wouldn't be that difficult. Ruud wondered what exactly was going to happen. He was sure the difficulty level would be adjusted to suit the students' levels. Ultimately, he decided not to think too much about it. Liorsis' case was far more important. Suddenly, Professor Raoul appeared behind Ruud and called out his name loudly. Dio and Liorsis looked at Professor Raoul anxiously. Professor Raoul told Ruth to follow him. Ruud stared at Professor Raoul in surprise. At the same time, Princess Utanan was talking to Ram. She told Ram that Tessie had discovered something interesting, so she would be participating in the field training and going with Tessie. Ram screamed in surprise and anxiety, asking what Princess Utanan was doing.
Meanwhile, Professor Raoul drags Ruud along with him. Helio Magic School's training arena, Lapis bertanya, "Why is everyone gathered here?" She's then told that Professor Raoul will be fighting against a student from Eden. Lapis is stunned. Who? Who exactly? She asks. The man everyone is talking about right now. It seems his name is Ruud Christie. Ruud Christie stood silently, staring at the wooden training sword in his hand. He couldn't understand. How did the situation even turn out this way? Dio stepped forward, unable to believe it. Professor, why fight someone who hasn't even done anything wrong? But Professor Raoul simply told Dio to disappear. Okay, Dio replied, quickly hiding behind Liorsis. He whispered anxiously, Will nothing happen to Ruud? Ruud sighed to himself. He had expected something like this might happen, but who would have thought Professor Raoul would be this stubborn? Around them, the students watched the scene in total confusion. Still, Ruud decided this was actually a good thing. It was a great opportunity to show everyone how ordinary he was, and finally make them lose interest. Let's begin, Professor Raoul shouted, taking a fighting stance. Ruud asked, sounding annoyed. Wait, why am I holding a wooden sword? Meanwhile, Professor Raoul was wielding a real sword. He suggested that Ruud use magic. That way, he claimed, there wouldn't be any problems. Ruud tried to argue that it wasn't fair, but before he could even finish, Professor Raoul was already charging. Ruud realized he had only one choice. He had to let Professor Raoul injure him. He had to lose. But the attack was too fierce, and Ruth's body reflexively dodged. Ruth thought that if the attack hit her, she wouldn't just suffer a simple wound. So she continued to avoid Professor Raoul, trying not to even talk to him. A student standing next to her noticed it. That student from Eden, she was dodging all of the professor's attacks. Fight! Professor Raoul shouted at Ruth. He wouldn't give her the slightest leeway. Then he attacked again. Dio, who was watching the fight with Liorsis, shouted, Ruud, be careful! Ruud blocked Raoul's slash with his wooden sword. He felt his reflexes working again. There was simply no way to avoid it. Kayuro's sword couldn't withstand the pressure, and it cracked. Incredible! His teammates exclaimed. Liorsis stepped forward, using his hand to push Professor Raoul's sword aside.
Professor Raoul warned Liorsus not to interfere. It was dangerous. But Dio shouted back, "It's dangerous regardless!" Snap! Rod's sword broke in two. Raoul replied that it wouldn't have broken if Rad had only used magic. But Rad said he wouldn't have fought Professor Raoul in the first place. Raoul then asked, "Why?" Rod replied that firstly, he didn't want to, and secondly, his skill just wasn't enough to do it. Lapis's friend remarked that it was truly amazing. He had never seen the professor so excited. Professor Raoul, however, said he wouldn't accept Rad's refusal. Lapis's interlocutor mentioned he saw Rad block the professor's sword. Even without magic, Rad had managed to withstand such a brutal attack. Professor Raoul told Rad he could take the professor's sword, but Rad refused. He said he should fight someone else, someone who would be honored to take such an extraordinary private lesson with the professor.
Rod spoke out to Professor Raoul and suggested that, rather than force sparring on someone who wasn't interested, the professor could spar with someone who would be honored to receive a private lesson from him. Lapis stated that she wanted to study with Professor Raoul, but the professor curtly refused. Lapis was immediately distraught. She had been rejected again, and in such a rude manner. Ruth felt like she had seen Lapis somewhere before. Professor Raoul turned to Rod Christie and said that they had been distracted too much, so they would continue another time. As he left, Professor Raoul added that they still had plenty of time. The four of them watched Raoul walk away. Then Dio suddenly thought, "Wait, why are there four of them?" Then he saw Ren standing to the side. Ren explained that because of the noise, he thought something had happened and asked, "Is Ruud okay?" Dio replied that Professor Raoul had just tried to kill Ruud, but other than that, everything was fine. Lapis, surrounded by her friends, was still hurt by being rejected, again. Ren didn't hesitate for a moment. He asked, "Is Ruud really okay?" Dio showed Ren the remains of Rod's sword and said it was broken, in two. Ruud asked Ren if he had received Ben's letter. Ren explained that he was there because he was worried about Ruud, and then he introduced himself. His name was Ren Noah. Rod asked again if Ren had received Ben's letter. Ren said he knew the man in front of him was Rad. Ben had mentioned Rad in his letters. Ren warmly thanked Rad for delivering the letter.
Then everyone heard someone calling out, loudly, to Ren. It was Ren's friend who ran over and asked, "What's happening? Why is everyone gathered here?" They explained that an unexpected situation had just occurred. Professor Raoul had challenged Ruud to a sword duel. Rad looked over at Liorsus. Liorsus spoke then, saying he was only alive thanks to Rad, and thanked her for protecting him. Dio agreed, saying Rad was right. If it weren't for Ardian, things could have ended deadly. Rad turned to Liorsus. "How could this have happened? Weren't you standing right behind me?" Liorsus replied that even if he were standing just one step away from Rad, he still would have blocked the professor's attack. And then he smiled. Everyone was shocked. They saw Liorsus smile for the first time. Meanwhile, at the Helios Magic School, the professors were discussing the upcoming field training. The director asked, "Has everything been agreed upon with the tower?" "Yes," they replied, adding that there were no major changes. The principal then reviewed the carries list of those who would be accompanying the junior students. On that list were Sheva von Hadelio and Anna Burb, as well as Linus Grimm and Cindy Yamas. The director frowned. There are only four of them? Then he stared thoughtfully at Sheva von Hadelio's name. They explained that since there were no classes right now, finding anyone else at the school would be quite difficult. The director asked, "But why is Sheva von Hadelio on the list?" Professor Hell replied that this Eden exercise would take a different format. This was the first time so many people were being teleported at once, and the entire operation was being coordinated with the tower. He anticipated that unexpected situations might arise, so he selected the most suitable individuals from among the carries. He added that the decision wasn't made lightly, and he hoped Hadelio would learn a lot from this field exercise.